Listen, not to the sound of my voice, but to the silence that lives between the words. There is a quality to certain silences that speaks louder than any sermon. It is the silence of a room where someone has just stopped talking, the silence of a footprint on a stone floor long after the foot has lifted. It is in such a silence that we must begin our story tonight, for it is a story about a step, one single, endless step. Imagine the sound of a man walking, not a hurried pace nor a triumphant march, just the slow, deliberate, dragging step of someone who has nowhere to be and all of eternity to get there. The scuff of a sandal on a Roman road, the tap of a worn boot on a cobbled medieval lane, the whisper of a soul on rain-slicked asphalt. You have heard this sound before in the quiet moments of your own life, and you have dismissed, but tonight we ask you to listen closer. Who is the owner of these footsteps? For nearly 2,000 years, a story has drifted through the corridors of history, a specter at the feast of civilization. It is the tale of a man condemned to walk the earth until the end of day, a man who looked upon the face of Christ, not with reverence, but with cruelty, and was sentenced to a life without end. He has been called many names, Malchus, Cartaphilus, Ahasuerus, but history knows him best by his sentence. He is the wandering Jew. Is he a figure of myth, born from the fevered guilt of the medieval mind? Or is he something else, a living echo, a mirror held up to the soul of humanity, reflecting our deepest fears about time, guilt, and the terrifying weight of an unanswered prayer? We will follow his footprints through the ages. We will stand in the shadows of cathedrals where he was seen in prayer. We will sit in the taverns where he was said to have paid for his bread with coins that crumbled to dust. We will trace the path of a man who cannot die, and in doing so, we may just glimpse a profound and unsettling truth about ourselves. Because the question is not whether he exists. The question is, if you could never die, what would become of your soul? Keep the candle lit. The night is long, and the road goes on forever. Listen again. There it is, the step. It is heavier now because the road is old. Not old as we understand age, with our calendars and our commemorations, but old as in ancient, worn. The stones beneath this step have felt the pressure of sandals, hooves, and chariot wheels for 1,000 years before this moment, and they will feel them for 2,000 years after. But for this one step, at this one moment, the stones hold their breath. The year is approximately 30 AD. The place is Jerusalem. The season is Passover, and the city is swollen with pilgrims, packed tight as seeds in a pomegranate. The air is a thick broth of smells, roasting lamb, dust, sweat, incense from the temple, and the ever-present faint sourness of unwashed bodies pressed together in expectation. There is tension in the air, an electric hum that has nothing to do with the sun's heat. Rome's shadow lies long over these streets, and the talk in every courtyard is of prophets and kingdoms, of deliverance and death. We are on a narrow street. It is not a grand boulevard. It is a crooked spine of worn stone, climbing gently uphill. The houses press in on either side, their upper stories leaning so close they almost kiss above our heads, blocking the sun and plunging the street into a cool, perpetual twilight. This is the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, though it does not yet bear that name. And here, on this street, at this hour, there is a man. He is not the man everyone is here to see. That man is somewhere ahead, struggling under the weight of a crossbeam, his back a map of fresh wounds. The crowd is a living thing, a beast with 1,000 heads and a single, brutal voice. It surges and retreats, pushing forward to catch a glimpse of the condemned, then recoiling from the Roman soldiers who clear the way with the butts of their spears. A man is not in the crowd. He is of the crowd. He is part of its edge, its ragged fringe. He stands in the doorway of his home or perhaps his workshop. Let us imagine him a cobbler. It is a fitting trade for a man about to begin an endless journey. He is not old nor young. His hands are stained and calloused. His face is ordinary, the kind of face you pass in a market and forget before you reach the next stall. His name, if names matter at this point, might be Ahasuerus, or Cartaphilus, or Malchus. The names are like coats laid upon him by later generations. For now, he is simply a man, a tired man perhaps, a man irritated by the commotion, by the disruption to his day, by the mob that presses against his door and makes his trade impossible. He steps forward, not to join the procession, but to push back against it, to claim his space, to defend the small perimeter of his life. And this is where the story begins, not with a scream or a curse, but with a step. His step forward, out of the shadows of his doorway and into the harsh white light of the Roman sun. The condemned man is passing at that very moment. He is a terrible sight. The crown on his head is not gold, but thorn. His face is so swollen from beatings that his own mother might struggle to recognize him. Yet beneath the ruin, there is something, a stillness, a focus that has nothing to do with the blood in his eyes or the wood on his shoulder. He stumbles. The crossbeam is monstrously heavy, and the road is slick with spilled water and offal. He falls, not dramatically, but with a sickening, graceless thud. The wood crashes down. A soldier curses and kicks at the fallen man, trying to get him up. The crowd roars its approval or its pity. It is impossible to tell which. And the fallen man, propped for a moment on one elbow, looks up. He does not look at the soldier. He does not look at the crowd. He looks at the man standing in the doorway, the cobbler, the ordinary man who simply wanted his space back. Their eyes meet. What passes between them in that glance? The stories will later say it was a look of infinite sorrow, of divine judgment. But let us be honest with the silence. Perhaps it was simply a look of recognition. The recognition of two men, both exhausted, both trapped by forces larger than themselves, one at the end of his road, one at the beginning of his. The cobbler, feeling the weight of that gaze, does something human. He does something you or I might do, caught in a moment of stress and inconvenience. He speaks. Move on, he says, or perhaps get on with it. Or in the version that has echoed down the centuries, go quicker, why do you linger? It is not a great curse. It is not a speech. It is a muttered, irritable thing, the reflex of a man annoyed by another's suffering interrupting his day. The man on the ground, the condemned, does not move for a long, terrible moment. He continues to look at the cobbler, and then, with a voice that is not loud, but seems to fill the entire street, he speaks. I am going, he says, and I will rest, but you will walk until I return. He does not say it as a threat. He says it as a fact, as if he is simply telling the cobbler something about himself that the cobbler did not yet know. The soldiers haul him to his feet. The crowd surges forward. The moment passes. The cobbler stands in his doorway, the words hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. He does not feel any different. He does not feel a curse settle on his shoulders. He feels only a strange chill, despite the heat, a feeling that the world has just tilted slightly on its axis, and he is the only one who noticed. He steps back into his shop, into the smell of leather and old nails, and tries to forget the face of the man in the street. He will never forget it, not for a single day, not for a single century. For the rest of his life, which has just become very, very long, he will remember that look, and he will remember his own words. Move on. He has just been given an instruction, and he has just obeyed it in a way he could never have imagined. He is walking still. The days that followed should have been like any other, but the world had changed, though it looked the same. He went back to his leather and his awl. He cut soles from cured hides, shaped them against last, hammered nails into heels with a rhythm that had been his heartbeat for years. The customers came. They complained about the price, the fit, the delay, normal things, human thing. But he found himself stopping, in the middle of a stitch, in the middle of a sentence. He would look up, suddenly certain that someone was standing in the doorway, watching him, but there was never anyone there. Only the shifting light, only the dust, only the endless murmur of the city beyond his threshold. He heard the news 3 days later. They had taken the man from the street, the one with the thorn crown, and they had nailed him to a cross on a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. They said the earth shook when he died. They said the sky went dark at midday, as if God himself had pulled a blanket over the world in grief. The cobbler listened to these stories as he worked, his hands moving automatically, his mind far away. He did not tell anyone about the look, about the words. Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself, and he had been there. He tried to reason with himself. The man was a prophet, they said. Some said he was the Messiah. Prophets say things. They speak in riddles and metaphors. You will walk until I return. It was poetry, a figure of speech, a dying man's dramatic farewell. But the words did not feel like poetry. They felt like a nail driven into the sole of his foot. Weeks passed, the city returned to its uneasy quiet. The pilgrims left, the blood was scrubbed from the stones, life resumed its slow, grinding pace. And then, one morning, the cobbler looked at his hands. He had cut himself the day before, a slip of the awl, a deep gash across his palm. He had wrapped it in a strip of linen and thought nothing of it. But now, unwrapping the cloth to change the dressing, he stopped. The wound was gone, not healed, not scarred over, gone as if it had never been. The skin was smooth, unbroken, the same weathered skin he had worn for 30 years. He turned his hand over, staring at it, flexing his fingers. He pressed his thumbnail into the spot where the gash had been. Nothing, no pain, no memory of pain. A coldness bloomed in his chest, spreading outward like frost on a windowpane. He looked at his reflection in the blade of his knife. The same face, the same tired eyes, but behind the eyes, something new was stirring, a terrible, creeping awareness. "You will walk until I return." He left his shop that day. He did not lock the door. He simply walked away into the city, moving through the crowds with a purpose he did not understand. He walked to Golgotha. The hill was bare now, the crosses removed, the ground still dark in places where the blood had soaked deep into the earth. He stood there for a long time, watching the sun descend toward the horizon. He waited for a sign, for a voice, for the ground to open and swallow him. Nothing happened. The sun set. The stars came out. The wind blew cold from the desert. And he was still standing there. He was still alive. He began to understand, in that moment, the shape of what had happened to him. It was not a curse of fire and brimstone. It was not a demonic possession. It was something far simpler and far more terrible. He had been given exactly what he asked for. Move on, go quicker. And so he would, forever. He walked back to the city as the dawn broke, painting the stone walls in shades of rose and gold. He walked through the Damascus gate, past the vendors setting up their stalls, past the children already playing in the dust. He walked to his shop, stood in the doorway, and looked inside. His workbench, his tools, the half-finished sandals still resting on the last. He did not go in. Instead, he turned. He faced the street, the same street where the man had fallen, where their eyes had met. And then, with a step that felt no different from any step he had ever taken, he began to walk. Not toward anything, just away. Away from the shop, away from the city, away from the life that was no longer his. He walked south toward the desert. The sun climbed higher, the heat grew fierce, and still he walked. He walked until his legs ached. He walked until the city was a smudge on the horizon behind him. He walked until the landscape became nothing but rock and sand and sky. And then he stopped because he could not walk forever, or so he thought. He sat on a rock, his breath ragged, his throat parched. He was mortal. He was human. He could feel thirst, hunger, exhaustion. The curse, if it was a curse, had not made him a god. It had only made him unable to stop being a man. He would age, he would feel pain. He could be cut, burned, beaten, but he would not die from it. The wound would heal, the sickness would pass. The years would pile upon him like leaves in an autumn that never ended, and still he would breathe, still he would think, still he would remember. Especially the remembering. That was the true weight, he would later learn. Not the walking, the remembering. Every face he would ever love, he would watch grow old and crumble to dust. Every city he would ever enter, he would watch rise and fall. Every wound, every joy, every moment of grace or cruelty would be stored away in the vast, ever-expanding library of his memory, with no death to erase it. He sat on the rock in the desert, the sun burning his skin, and for the first time he wept. Not for himself, not yet. He wept for the mother he would outlive, for the wife he would never dare to marry, for the children he would never hold, knowing he would have to watch them wither and die while he remained, unchanging, a stone in the river of time. The tears dried on his cheeks. The sun began to sink. He stood up. There was no choice. There never is. When you cannot die, you cannot stop. Stopping is a luxury of the mortal. For him, motion was the only prayer left. He turned his face toward the horizon, toward the centuries that stretched before him like an endless road, and he took another step. The dust rose around his feet, caught by the evening wind, and scattered. Somewhere behind him, in a city of stone, they were still telling stories about a man who rose from the dead. But the cobbler knew the truth. The dead rest. It is the living who walk. And he would walk through empires and plagues, through cathedrals and ruins, through the laughter of children and the silence of battlefields. He would walk until the stars burned out and the earth grew cold. He would walk until a certain face appeared again on the horizon and a certain voice said, "Enough." He walked through the night, and the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. By morning, he had vanished into the desert, and the legend had begun. The desert does not kill. This is the first lesson the wanderer learned. It tests, it wears away. It reduces a man to his essentials, bone, breath, and will, but it does not kill, not him, not anymore. He walked for 40 days, or perhaps it was 40 years. Time in the desert is a fluid thing, measured not by the sun's passage, but by the slow erosion of the self. The days were furnaces, the nights were frozen rivers of darkness, where the stars looked close enough to touch, sharp as shards of glass scattered across a velvet cloth. He ate what the desert offered, a lizard caught and eaten raw, a handful of bitter berries from a scrubby bush. He learned to find water in the most unlikely places, the hollow of a rock, the dew that gathered on his cloak at dawn. His body adapted, as bodies do, but his body was no longer the master. It was a vessel that could not break. He spoke to himself in the beginning. He recited his life story to the rocks, the names of his parents, his neighbors, the girl he had once hoped to marry. He told the wind about the feel of leather in his hands, the satisfaction of a well-made shoe, the simple joy of a full stomach and a quiet evening. He told these things because he was afraid of forgetting, because if he forgot who he had been, what would be left? But the desert does not listen, it only echoes. And so, eventually, he stopped speaking. The silence became a companion, then a friend, then a teacher. It was in the silence that he began to understand. The curse was not a punishment, it was a commission. He had been made a witness, the only witness who would live to tell the tale, not in words, but in presence. He would see the end of every story except his own. One night, sitting cross-legged on a slab of sandstone, watching a crescent moon hang low over the horizon, he felt something shift inside him. Not a crack, but a softening. The hard knot of terror and self-pity that had lived in his chest since that day on the Via Dolorosa began, just slightly, to loosen. He thought of the man's face again, the eyes. He had been so focused on the words, on the sentence, that he had never truly considered the look. There was no anger in it, no triumph, only a sorrow so deep it could fill ocean. "I am going, and I will rest." The man had spoken of rest as a destination, as something he was walking toward, not away from. And in that moment, sitting under the desert moon, the wanderer understood. He was not being punished because the man hated him. He was being saved because the man loved him. Love that would not let him go. Love that insisted he stay, that he see, that he witness everything that was to come. The man had not cursed him to endless suffering. He had blessed him with endless presence. The suffering was merely the shape it took in a heart not yet ready to receive such a gift. He wept again that night, but the tears were different. They were not for himself. They were for the weight of a love so vast it could condemn a man to eternity just to keep him company. In the morning, he stood and faced the east, where the sun was rising in a blaze of copper and gold. He did not know where he would go. He only knew that he would go there on his feet, one step at a time, and that he would be present for whatever awaited. He walked out of the desert and into the world. The first village he reached was small, a cluster of mud brick houses huddled around a well. Children played in the dust. Women drew water. Men sat in the shade, talking of crops and weather, normal life, human life. He approached the well, his throat parched, his skin cracked and burned. A woman looked at him, saw a beggar, a traveler, a man in need. She offered him her gourd without a word. He drank. The water was cool and sweet. It tasted like forgiveness. He handed the gourd back. Their eyes met. She saw nothing unusual, a stranger passing through. She smiled, a small, tired smile, and turned back to her work. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to say, "I am the man who spoke to your God. I am the one who cannot die. I have walked through the desert for longer than you have been alive, and I will walk through centuries after your great-grandchildren are dust." But he said nothing, because what would be the point? She had her life, her brief, beautiful, mortal life. To burden her with his eternity would be a cruelty beyond measure. So he simply nodded, turned, and walked on. Behind him, the village continued its slow dance of days. Births and death, weddings and funeral, laughter and tears. The whole glorious, heartbreaking pageant of human existence played out in the shadow of a man who could not stay to watch it end. He walked through the village and out the other side, his footsteps leaving prints in the dust that the wind would erase by evening. But the memory of her face, of the gourd, of the cool water on his tongue that he would keep. He would keep all of it, every face, every kindness, every cruelty, every moment of grace witnessed in 2,000 years of walking. That was the commission, that was the gift, to be the memory of the world. He walked on, and the sun climbed higher, and the road stretched before him like an unspooled thread leading through the labyrinth of history. He did not know that in a few hundred years, men would write down his story, that they would give him names and dates and sightings, that kings would seek him out for wisdom, and peasants would cross themselves when he passed, that he would become a legend, a myth, a figure of fear and fascination. He did not know that he would outlive Jerusalem itself, watch it fall to Rome, rise again, fall again, that he would stand in the Forum as the empire crumbled and walk through the ruins of libraries where his own story was preserved on parchment. He knew none of this, he only knew the next step, and the next, and the next. The road does not end, it only changes. And somewhere far ahead, at the very edge of forever, a man waits, a man who promised to return. Until that day, the wanderer walks, and the world, without knowing it, walks with him. The centuries turn, not with a sound, but with a sigh. For the wanderer, time does not pass so much as accumulate. It piles up behind him like fallen leaves, each year a dry, rustling memory, each decade a layer of sediment compressing into the stone of his consciousness. He does not count the years. There are too many. He learns to measure time instead by the slow drift of languages, the rise and fall of empires, the gradual erosion of faces he once loved. He walks because walking is the only constant, the only prayer that never ends. We find him now in a place of power, a city built on 7 hills, swollen with plunder and pride. The air here tastes different, of smoke from 1,000 hearths, of exotic spices from ships that dock at Ostia, of something else, something metallic, the smell of empire, the smell of blood dried on stone. Rome, the eternal city, an ironic destination for a man who cannot die. The year is approximately 64 AD. The emperor is Nero, though the wanderer does not know this and would not care if he did. He has seen emperors come and go. He has learned that they are all the same beneath the purple, frightened men clutching at power like children clutching at toys, terrified of the darkness they sense waiting for them. He walks the streets of Rome as the sun sets, painting the marble columns in shades of blood and honey. The Forum is crowded with the usual parade of humanity, senators in their togas, merchants hawking goods, slaves bearing burdens, priests leading sacrificial animals toward the temples. The noise is tremendous. 1,000 conversations, 1,000 arguments, 1,000 lies, all woven together into the great tapestry of the city's voice. He moves through them like a ghost. No one sees him. No one ever sees him. He has learned to walk in the spaces between attention, to be the face that slides past the corner of the eye, forgotten before it is registered. But tonight something is different. There is a tension in the air, a hum beneath the noise. People speak in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders. The name on every lip is a strange one, Christianus, Christian. He has heard this word before in the eastern provinces. It refers to followers of a man who died decades ago, a man whose name still echoes in the wanderer's memory like a bell that will never stop ringing. They say these Christians gather in secret, in the catacombs beneath the city. They say they worship a criminal, a rebel, a man executed by Rome. They say they eat his flesh and drink his blood. The wanderer stops in the shadow of a column and listens. The fire, a merchant is saying to a friend. They say the Christians started it. They want to destroy Rome. They want to burn the world. The friend nods, his face tight with fear. The emperor knows. He has plans for them. They will pay. The wanderer moves on, but the words follow him. The fire. He has seen fires before. He has seen cities burn. But there is something in the air tonight, something that makes the hair on his arms stand on end, a premonition, a whisper from the future. He finds a quiet corner near the Circus Maximus, a place where the poor huddle in makeshift shelters against the outer wall of the great arena. He sits with his back to the stone, closes his eyes, and listens to the night. He does not sleep. He has not slept truly in years. He rests, but rest is not sleep. Sleep is a small death, a temporary release from consciousness. He has been denied that release, so he rests with his eyes open, watching the stars wheel overhead, waiting for whatever comes next. It comes in the form of a glow on the horizon. At first he thinks it is the moon rising, but the moon is behind him, a thin crescent low in the west. The glow is in the east, near the Palatine Hill, and it is growing. He stands, the air shifts, a sudden wind rushing toward the flames, feeding them, and then he hears it, the sound that haunts every city, every age, the crackle and roar of fire, hungry and unstoppable. Rome is burning. He does not run toward it. He does not run away. He walks, as he always walks, toward the light, because that is what a witness does. He goes where the story is. The streets fill with chaos. People pour past him, their faces masks of terror, clutching children, clutching valuables, clutching nothing at all. The fire moves faster than any fire should, leaping from building to building, consuming wood and cloth and flesh with equal appetite. The heat is immense, a physical pressure against his skin. The smoke fills his lungs, makes his eyes stream. He walks on. He reaches a street where the fire has not yet arrived, but will soon. The residents are fleeing, but one house remains occupied. He hears the sound through the open door, a child crying, high and thin and terrified. He does not think. Thinking is for those who have time. He simply moves. Inside, the house is already filling with smoke. He finds the child in a corner, a girl of perhaps 5 years, her face streaked with tears and soot. He scoops her into his arms and carries her out, through the door, into the street, away from the flame. He sets her down in a safe place, away from the fire's path. Her mother appears, screaming, snatching the child, embracing her. The woman looks at him, this stranger with the calm eyes and the soot-stained face, and tries to speak, but the words will not come. She simply nods, a gesture that contains all the gratitude in the world. He nods back, and then he turns and walks away, back toward the fire. Because there will be others, there are always others. He spends the night pulling people from burning buildings, leading the lost to safety, carrying the injured to places where they might be tended. He does not count how many he saved. He does not remember their faces. He will remember them later, in the quiet centuries, when the fire is only a memory and he has time to mourn every one of them, saved or lost. By morning, the fire has burned itself out, leaving a swath of destruction through the heart of the city. The wanderer stands on the Palatine Hill, looking down at the smoldering ruin. The air is thick with ash, falling like grey snow. And in the distance, he hears a new sound, the sound of soldiers marching, the sound of orders shouted, the sound of people screaming, not from fire, but from fear. The Christians, they will be the scapegoats. They will be rounded up, tortured, executed in ways designed to entertain the masses. They will be crucified, burned alive, torn apart by wild animals in the arena. The wanderer closes his eyes. He remembers another execution, another mob, another innocent man carrying a cross. The pattern never changes, only the names. He walks away from the forum, away from the smoke, away from the screams that are just beginning. He walks because that is all he can do. Behind him, a new chapter in his legend is being written. In the catacombs, among the Christians who survive, a story will spread. A story of a stranger who appeared in the fire, who saved lives and vanished. A stranger with sad eyes and no name. A stranger who seemed to know things he could not know. They will whisper that he was an angel or a demon or something in between. They will not know that he was only a man who cannot die, walking through the fire, searching for something he lost on a dusty road in Jerusalem so long ago that even he has begun to forget what it felt like to hope. The catacombs breathe. This is what the wanderer notices first when he descends into them for the first time. They breathe with the slow, patient breath of the earth itself, drawing in the living and exhaling the dead. He comes to them not as a seeker, but as a refugee. The city above has become a slaughterhouse. Nero's gardens blaze with human torches, their light meant to illuminate the darkness of Rome's reconstruction. The Christians die in ways that make the crowds cheer and the philosophers look away. The wanderer cannot save them all. He cannot save any of them, not really. He can only be present, only witness, only remember. So he goes underground. The entrance is hidden in an abandoned quarry outside the walls, a dark mouth in the earth that swallows him without hesitation. He descends narrow steps carved into the soft volcanic rock, his hand brushing against walls that are cool and damp. The air changes. It grows heavy with the smell of earth and clay, and something else, the faint, sweet scent of incense, burned in rituals he does not yet understand. The tunnels branch and twist, a labyrinth designed to confuse the living and accommodate the dead. Niches line the walls, rectangular hollows where bodies rest in their eternal sleep. Some are sealed with slabs of marble or terracotta, inscribed with names and symbols. The fish, the anchor, the Good Shepherd, signs that mean nothing to the authorities above, but everything to the faithful below. He walks deeper, and the tunnels open into chambers, small rooms where the ceiling rises just enough to stand upright. And here, in these underground chapels, he finds them. The living. They huddle together by the light of oil lamps, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. They pray in whispers, their voices merging into a soft, constant murmur that fills the chambers like the hum of bees in a hidden hive. They share what little food they have. They comfort each other. They wait. When they see him, they do not startle. They have learned that strangers in the catacombs are either friends or soldiers, and soldiers do not come alone. They see a man with weary eyes and the dust of centuries on his clothes, and they make room for him by the fire. He sits, he does not speak, he listens, and what he hears changes something in him. They speak of a man they call Jesus, not as a historical figure, not as a teacher long dead, but as a living presence, as a friend, as a lover, as someone who walks with them through the darkness, who holds them when they are afraid, who waits for them on the other side of death. He is risen, an old woman whispers to a child on her lap. He died, but death could not hold him. He walks among us still, though we cannot see him. And one day he will return, and we will be with him forever. The wanderer closes his eyes. The words wash over him like water over stone. He is risen. He walks among us still. One day he will return. He has heard these words before, in different forms, from different lips. But now, in the darkness of the catacombs, surrounded by the living and the dead, they strike him with a force he did not expect. Until I return. The sentence, the commission, the curse, or was it? He opens his eyes and looks at the faces around him. These people are not afraid to die. They are afraid, yes, they are human after all, but beneath the fear is something else. A certainty, a hope so powerful it makes their eyes shine in the lamplight like candles in the dark. They believe, not in a memory but in a promise, not in a ghost but in a return. And he realizes, with a clarity that cuts through the fog of centuries, that he is living proof of that promise. He walks because the one who spoke to him is not dead. He endures because the one who sentenced him is coming back. He is the evidence they seek, walking among them, and they do not even know it. He could tell them, he could open his mouth and speak the words that would shatter their world and remake it. I was there, I saw him, I heard his voice. He is real and he is coming. But he does not, he cannot, because to tell them would be to make it about him, to center himself in a story that is not his. These people do not need a witness from the past. They have their own witness burning in their hearts. They have the flame that the wanderer lost somewhere in the desert, the flame he has been walking to find ever since. He stays with them for a time, days, weeks. Time in the catacombs is measured by the lighting of lamps, the sharing of meals, the arrival of new refugees, and the departure of the dead. He helps where he can. He carries water from the hidden springs deep beneath the city. He digs new niches for those who do not survive. He holds hands as they pass, watching their faces relax into the final stillness he will never know. One night, a young man approaches him. He is perhaps 20, with the intense eyes of a believer and the trembling hands of a fugitive. I have seen you before, the young man says. The wanderer says nothing. In the fire, the young man continues. You carried my sister from a burning house. You set her down in the street and you walked away. I searched for you afterwards to thank you, but you were gone. The wanderer looks at him. The young man's face is familiar, though he cannot place it. So many faces, so many fires. You saved her, the young man says. She is here in the catacombs. She lives because of you. The wanderer nods slowly. I am glad. The young man studies him, his eyes narrowing. You do not look older. You look the same in the fire as you do now. And the fire was, weeks ago, but you look the same. The wanderer feels the familiar coldness, the sensation of being seen too clearly. He has learned to avoid this moment, to fade before it arrives. But here, in the close confines of the catacombs, there is nowhere to fade to. I have a good face for remembering, he says quietly. It stays in the mind. The young man does not look convinced, but he is young, and the young are quick to accept mysteries they cannot solve. He nods, thanks the wanderer again, and returns to his family. But the wanderer knows the seeds are being planted, the stories are beginning to form. In the whispers of these catacombs, in the grateful memories of those he has saved, a legend is taking root. He will be called an angel, a protector, a ghost. And one day, centuries from now, a chronicler will write down a tale he heard from a traveler who heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from a Christian in Rome, who swore he met a man who was there when Christ walked the earth. The wanderer leaves the catacombs the same way he entered, alone, in silence, walking. He emerges into a world that has changed again. Nero is dead. The persecutions have faded, replaced by new cruelties, new emperors, new fears. He stands at the edge of the city, looking back at the hills of Rome, at the temples and the tenements, at the great arena where so many have died. The sun is setting, painting the city in gold and purple. Somewhere beneath his feet, in the darkness of the catacombs, the faithful are still praying, still hopping, still waiting. Just like him, he turns his face toward the north, toward the provinces, toward the endless road, and he walks. Behind him, the shadow in the forum fades into the dusk, and the legend takes its first uncertain steps into the pages of history. The road from Rome to the provinces is long, and the wanderer walks it in the company of ghosts. Not literal ghosts, he has never seen one, despite spending centuries among those who claim to have done so. The ghosts he carries are internal. They live behind his eyes, a vast and growing congregation of the dead. Every face he has ever loved, every kindness he has ever received, every cruelty he has ever witnessed, they are all there, waiting in the quiet moments, rising to meet him when the road grows long and the silence deepens. He walks north through Italy, past farms and vineyards, through villages that will one day grow into cities and cities that will one day crumble back into earth. The people he passes see a traveler, a pilgrim, a wanderer. They offer him bread, water, a place by the fire. He accepts with gratitude and moves on before they can ask his name. He learns the rhythms of the road, the way the light changes with the season, the way languages shift as he crosses invisible boundaries, one dialect melting into another, the way empires rise and fall while the peasant in the field simply continues to plow, indifferent to the names of those who claim to rule him. Centuries pass like this. He does not count them. He cannot. There are too many. He is in Gaul when the news reaches him that Rome has fallen. Not the city. The city still stands, battered and diminished, but still there. The empire, the great beast that bestrode the world, has finally collapsed under its own weight, torn apart by barbarians from without and corruption from within. He hears the news from a monk in a small monastery, a place of stone and silence tucked into a fold of the hill. The monk is old, his hands shaking as he turns the pages of a manuscript, his eyes bright with the fire of someone who believes the end of the world is near. The city of man has fallen, the monk says, his voice trembling. Now only the city of God remains. The wanderer nods. He has heard this before too. Every generation believes it is the last. Every generation is wrong. He stays at the monastery for a time, helping in the garden, copying manuscripts with a hand that never tires, listening to the monks chant their prayers in Latin. They accept him as a brother, though he never takes the vow. They assume he is a pilgrim, a penitent, a man seeking God. He does not correct them. He is seeking something, though he is no longer certain what. One evening, the old monk finds him in the scriptorium, alone with a manuscript and a candle. "I have been reading something," the monk says, lowering himself onto a stool with the careful grace of the aged. "A chronicle from the East. It speaks of a man who walked with Christ." The wanderer's hand stills on the page. "A man who was there," the monk continues, "on the road to Golgotha. A man who refused him comfort, who told him to move on. And Christ, they say, looked at him and said, 'I am going, but you will wait until I return.'" The wanderer does not breathe. The chronicle says this man still walks the earth, that he has been seen in Armenia, in Persia, in the cities of the East. They call him Cartaphilus, the wanderer. The silence in the scriptorium is absolute. The candle flame flickers, casting dancing shadows on the wall. "Do you believe it?" the wanderer asks. His voice is calm, but something in it makes the monk lean closer. "I believe," the monk says slowly, "that truth is stranger than any tale we tell. I believe that God's ways are not our ways. I believe that if such a man existed, he would be the loneliest creature in all of creation." The wanderer looks down at the manuscript before him. The words blur. He sees, not the Latin text, but a dusty street in Jerusalem, a face, eyes that held the weight of the world. "I think," he says quietly, "you may be right." The monk studies him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he reaches out and takes the wanderer's hand. He turns it over, looking at the palm, the fingers, the calluses from centuries of labor. "You have the hands of a worker," the monk says, "the hands of a man who has built many things." "I have built many things," the wanderer agrees, "and lost them all, I suspect." The wanderer says nothing, but something in his silence is answer enough. The monk releases his hand and stands, his joints protesting. "I will not ask your secret," he says. "I am old, and I have learned that some questions are better left unasked. But I will tell you this." He pauses at the door, his figure silhouetted against the candlelight from the corridor. "If you are who I think you might be, then you carry a burden beyond any I can imagine. But remember, even the longest road has an end. Even the darkest night gives way to dawn." He promised to return. Believe that. It is all any of us can do. He leaves. The wanderer sits alone in the scriptorium, the candle burning low, the manuscript forgotten before him. Outside, the wind rises, carrying the first chill of autumn. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls. He thinks about the monk's words, about the chronicle from the East, about the name they have given him, Cartaphilus. He does not know where it came from or what it means, but he knows that his story is no longer his own. It has escaped him like a bird from an open cage, and now it flies through the world, landing in the minds of men who will shape it, change it, make it their own. He is becoming a legend while still walking the earth. The thought is strange and sad and strangely comforting, because if his story lives beyond him, then perhaps he is not entirely alone. Perhaps, in the minds of those who tell his tale, he finds a kind of companionship, a kind of rest. He blows out the candle and sits in the darkness, listening to the wind. In the morning, he will leave. He will walk north into the forests of Gaul, toward the rising kingdoms of the Franks. He will walk through centuries of war and peace, through plagues and famines, through the slow, painful birth of a new world from the ruins of the old. He will walk, and the legend will walk with him, a shadow at his side. But tonight, in the darkness of the scriptorium, he allows himself a moment of stillness, a moment of something almost like peace. He thinks of the monk's words, "Even the longest road has an end." He hopes, with a hope that has grown thin and worn over the centuries, that this is true. The wind sighs through the stones of the monastery, and the wanderer closes his eyes, and for a few brief hours he rests. In the catacombs beneath Rome, in the chambers where the faithful still gather, a story is already spreading. A story of a man who came out of the fire, who walked through the darkness, who held the hands of the dying and spoke words of comfort in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere ancient. They do not know his name, they do not know where he came from or where he went, but they remember him. And in the remembering, they keep him alive. The shadow in the forum has moved on, slipping through the cracks of history, appearing and disappearing like a figure in a dream. But the dream lingers. It takes root in the minds of men who will one day write it down, who will give it shape and substance, who will transform a lonely wanderer into a symbol of something vast and terrible and strangely beautiful. The legend is growing, it is spreading, it is becoming something more than the man who inspired it. And somewhere on a road in Gaul, a figure walks alone under the stars, his footsteps making no sound, his shadow stretching long behind him in the moonlight. He does not look back. He never looks back. There is too much road ahead. The bells, they are the first thing he hears, emerging from a forest that has grown dense and dark around him. Bells, tolling across a valley, calling the faithful to prayer. The sound is new in the world. A few centuries ago, there were no bells like these. Now they hang in towers of stone, their bronze throats shaping the hours, marking the boundaries between the sacred and the profane. He follows the sound. The forest gives way to fields, thin and poor, scratched from the earth by peasants who live on the edge of survival. A river curves through the valley, grey under a sky heavy with coming rain. And there, on a rise above the water, sits the city. It is not a city like Rome, with its marble and its monuments. This is a different kind of city, a medieval city, walls of grey stone, topped with battlements, houses huddled together for warmth and protection, their upper stories leaning out over narrow streets, and rising above them all, dominating everything, the cathedral. He stops at the edge of the fields and looks at it. The cathedral, a mountain of stone carved into something almost alive. Spires reach toward heaven like fingers clasped in prayer. Buttresses arch against the walls like the ribs of some great beast. Windows blaze with color, even in the gray light, telling stories in glass for those who cannot read. He has seen many wonders in his long walk, but this is something new. This is faith made visible. This is hope carved into permanence. He walks on toward the city gate. The year is approximately 1228. The place is a bishopric in northern Germany, though the name does not matter. They all blur together after a while. What matters is what waits for him inside those walls. What matters is the story that will attach itself to him here, the name that will follow him through the centuries. Ahasuerus. He does not know this yet. He only knows that the bells are calling, and he has learned to follow the bells. The gatekeeper barely glances at him as he passes. Another pilgrim, another wanderer. The city is full of them these days, drawn by the cathedral, by the relics, by the promise of forgiveness. He is just another face in the crowd. The streets are narrow and dark, the upper stories of the houses blocking what little light filters through the clouds. Mud squelches under his feet, mixed with refuse and straw. The smell is overwhelming, human waste, animal offal, smoke from countless hearths, and beneath it all, the sweet, cloying scent of incense drifting from the cathedral. He moves through the crowd, and the crowd parts around him without seeing him. He has perfected this art over the centuries, to be invisible while walking in plain sight. The cathedral draws him like a magnet. He passes through its great doors, into a space that steals his breath even after all he has seen. The interior is vast, a forest of stone columns reaching up into shadows where the ceiling disappears into darkness. Light pours through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in pools of ruby and sapphire and gold. Candles flicker at every altar, their flames like stars in an artificial heaven. And everywhere, the smell of incense, thick and sweet, hanging in the air like visible prayer. He stands in the nave, looking toward the high altar, where a priest raises the host, a small white circle against the gold of the tabernacle. The congregation kneels, their faces lifted, their lips moving in silent devotion. And he feels it. For the first time in centuries, he feels something like what he felt in the catacomb, a presence, a warmth, a sense that he is not entirely alone. He does not kneel, he cannot. His knees have forgotten how to bend in submission, but he stands, and he watches, and something in him shifts. After the service, the crowd disperses. He remains, moving through the side chapels, looking at the statues, the paintings, the relics in their golden caskets, fragments of bone, splinters of wood, pieces of cloth, all that remains of the saints, the martyrs, the witnesses. He wonders what they would leave of him if he could die. A worn sandal, a walking staff worn smooth by centuries of grip, a single tear preserved in a vial. The thought almost makes him smile, almost. He is standing before a painting of the crucifixion when he feels eyes on him. He does not turn. He has learned to feel attention the way others feel a change in the weather. "You have been here before," a voice says. It is an old voice, cracked and thin, but with a core of something hard beneath the frailty. He turns. An old man stands behind him, wrapped in a heavy cloak despite the warmth of the cathedral. His face is a map of wrinkles, his eyes pale and sharp as winter ice. "I have been in many cathedrals," the wanderer says. "This one," the old man insists. "I have seen you here, not today, years ago, decades, you do not change." The wanderer looks at him, really looks. And behind the wrinkles, behind the years, he sees something familiar, a young man's face superimposed on the old, a face from Rome, from the catacombs. "You were there," the wanderer says quietly, "in the fire. You were the one whose sister I carried." The old man's eyes widen. For a moment, he looks terrified, then the terror softens into something else, wonder, awe. "I knew it," he whispers. "All my life I have told the story, the stranger in the fire, the man with the sad eyes. My sister never forgot you. She prayed for you every day until she died. And now I am old and I am dying, and here you are, still the same, still walking." The wanderer says nothing. There is nothing to say. The old man reaches out and touches his arm, as if to confirm that he is real. His hand trembled. "They said you were an angel," he says. "My sister believed it until her last breath. But you are not an angel, are you?" "No," the wanderer says. "I am not." "Then what are you?" The wanderer looks past him, at the painting of the crucifixion, at the figure on the cross, head bowed, eyes closed, at the crowd below, the soldiers, the mourners, the ones who watched and did nothing. "I am a witness," he says. "Nothing more." The old man follows his gaze to the painting. Understanding dawns in his eye. "You were there," he breathes. "When it happened, you saw him." The wanderer does not answer, but the silence is answer enough. The old man sinks to his knees, there in the side chapel, his aged joints cracking against the stone. He crosses himself. He begins to pray, not to God, but to the wanderer, to the witness, to the man who stood on the Via Dolorosa and looked into the eyes of Christ. The wanderer reaches down and takes his arm, lifting him gently to his feet. "Do not," he says. "I am not holy, I am only tired." The old man looks at him with eyes full of tears. "Then let me give you rest. My home is small, but there is a bed, food, silence. Stay with me for a little while." The wanderer hesitates. He has learned that staying leads to questions, and questions lead to danger. But the old man's face, it is the face of everyone he has ever failed to save, everyone he has ever left behind. "One night," he says. The old man nods and leads him out of the cathedral into the gathering dusk. Behind them, in the shadows of the side chapel, a figure watches them go. A monk, young and intense, his eyes bright with the fire of a scholar who has just stumbled upon something extraordinary. He heard nothing, but he saw everything. The old man kneeling, the stranger lifting him up, the look between them. He does not know what he has witnessed, but he will write it down. He will tell his abbot, and the story will spread, growing with each telling, until it reaches the ears of a chronicler named Matthew Paris, who will record it for posterity. The wanderer has been seen again, and this time he has a name. Ahasuerus. The old man's name was Heinrich, and his house was a memory of better time. It stood near the cathedral wall, a narrow building of 3 stories, leaning slightly as if tired from centuries of holding itself upright. The ground floor had once been a shop. Heinrich's father had been a merchant of fine cloth, but now it stood empty, the counters bare, the shelves collecting dust. The family money had run out long ago, dissipated by time and taxes and the slow decay that comes to all things. Heinrich led him up a steep staircase to the living quarters on the 2nd floor. A single room, with a bed in one corner, a table by the window, a small hearth where a fire struggled against the damp. The walls were bare stone, but someone had tried to make it home. A faded tapestry showing scenes from the life of some saint, a wooden crucifix above the bed, a few precious books stacked on a shelf. "Sit," Heinrich said, gesturing to the only chair. "I will heat some soup." The wanderer sat. He watched as the old man moved slowly around the room, his joints protesting, his breath coming in short gasps. He wanted to help, but he knew that offering would be an insult. This was Heinrich's home, his hospitality, his dignity. The wanderer had learned, over the centuries, to accept gifts gracefully. It was sometimes the only gift the giver had left. The soup was thin, mostly water, a few vegetables, a scrap of meat that must have cost the old man more than he could afford. But it was warm, and it was offered with love, and the wanderer ate it as if it were the finest meal in the world. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the wind moaning around the window. Outside, the bells of the cathedral told the hour. Compline, the last prayer of the day. "You have been walking a long time," Heinrich said finally. It was not a question. "Yes, how long?" The wanderer considered the question. He had stopped counting centuries ago, but he could still do the math if he tried. From that day on the Via Dolorosa to this night in a German city. 30 years, no more, much more. "More than 1,000 years, he said. The number felt strange on his tongue, like a word from a language he had almost forgotten. Heinrich nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had always suspected. "I have lived 83 years, he said, "and I am tired, so tired. I cannot imagine 1,000. I cannot imagine what that would do to a man's soul." The wanderer looked into the fire. "It does things," he said quietly. "It wears away the edges. It makes you forget what you were before. It makes you wonder if you were ever anything at all. And yet you remember," Heinrich said. "You remember my sister. You remember the fire. You remember him." The wanderer closed his eyes. The faces rose, as they always did. The woman with the gourd of water in the village outside Jerusalem. The child in the burning house. The thousands upon thousands he had seen born, live, love, suffer, die. They were all there behind his eyes, waiting. "I remember everything," he said. "That is the curse, not the walking, the remembering." Heinrich was quiet for a long moment. Then he rose, with difficulty, and went to the shelf of books. He selected one, a heavy volume bound in leather, and brought it to the table. "This is the chronicle of our city," he said, opening it to a page marked with a ribbon. "The bishop's scribe writes down everything of importance: births, deaths, visits from nobles, miracles, signs from God." He pushed the book toward the wanderer. "Read." The wanderer looked at the page. The script was careful and ornate, the Latin slightly awkward but clear enough. And there, in the middle of the page, he saw words that made his breath catch. "In the year of our Lord 1228, a stranger appeared in the city. He was seen in the cathedral by several witnesses, who remarked upon his sorrowful countenance and his aged appearance. Yet when questioned, he could not say whence he came, and his speech was strange, as if he had learned our tongue from books rather than from living men. Some say he is the wandering Jew, condemned by our Lord to walk the earth until the second coming. He calls himself Ahasuerus." "Ahasuerus," the wanderer murmured. "They have given me a name. It is the name of a Persian king in the scriptures," Heinrich said. "The scribe thought it fitting, a name from the East, from ancient times." He paused. "But it is not your true name, is it?" The wanderer shook his head. "I have forgotten my true name. It was lost somewhere in the desert in the 1st century. Perhaps that is the real curse. Not the walking, not the remembering, the forgetting of who I was before I became this." Heinrich reached across the table and took his hand. The old man's fingers were cold, his grip surprisingly strong. "Then let me give you a new memory," he said. "A good one. Tonight in this house, you are not Ahasuerus the wanderer. You are not the wandering Jew. You are simply a guest, sharing soup and fire with an old man who is grateful for your company. Can you remember that?" The wanderer looked at him, at his wrinkled face, his pale eyes, his thin white hair, at the kindness there, the simple human kindness that asked for nothing in return. "Yes," he said, "I can remember that." They sat together through the night, talking of small things. Heinrich spoke of his sister, who had died 50 years ago, still telling the story of the man who saved her from the fire. He spoke of his wife, who had passed in the great sickness, and of his children, who had moved away to other cities and never returned. He spoke of his faith, which had sustained him through all the losses, and of his hope, which had never dimmed. The wanderer listened. He did not speak of his own past. He did not speak of the faces he carried, the cities he had seen rise and fall, the empires that had crumbled to dust while he walked on. He listened, and he let Heinrich's words fill the silence, and for a few hours he was almost at peace. Near dawn, Heinrich fell asleep in his chair, his head nodding forward, his breath evening into the slow rhythm of the old. The wanderer rose and covered him with a blanket from the bed. He stood by the window, looking out at the city waking below. The bells began again, matins, the first prayer of the new day. He turned and looked at Heinrich one last time. The old man would not last much longer, a year, perhaps two. Then he would join his sister, his wife, his children, the long line of the dead that stretched behind the wanderer like a shadow reaching toward eternity. He wanted to wake him, to thank him, to say something that would capture the gift of this night, the warmth of this small room, the kindness of this dying man. But there were no words. There never were. He left as he had come, silently, alone, walking. He descended the narrow stairs, passed through the empty shop, and stepped out into the cold dawn. The streets were empty, the city still sleeping. He walked toward the gate, toward the road, toward the next century. Behind him, in the chronicle of the city, a scribe would add another entry. The stranger called Ahasuerus was seen again in our city, in the company of an old man named Heinrich. He departed at dawn, and none know where he went. Some say he will return at the end of days. Others say he walks still, waiting for the one who sentenced him to return. The wanderer walked on, and the legend walked with him. And in the cathedral, the bells continued to toll, marking the hours for those who still had hours to mark. The road from the city led through fields and forests, past villages and monasteries, into a world that was changing faster than the wanderer had ever known. The centuries were no longer flowing like a slow river. They were accelerating, tumbling over each other like water approaching a falls. He felt it in the way people spoke, the way they dressed, the way they looked at the world. Something was shifting, something was waking up. He walked through the great plagues, when death walked openly through every street and village, reaping harvests so abundant that the living could not bury the dead. He carried bodies to mass grave. He held children as they convulsed and stilled. He watched whole families vanish in a matter of days, their names erased from the earth as if they had never been. And he did not sicken. He could not. The plague passed through him like wind through a dead tree, leaving him standing while all around him fell. They noticed, sometime, in the chaos of the dying, a man who did not die drew attention. He learned to move faster, to stay ahead of the questions, to be gone before the whispers could become accusation. But the whispers followed. They always followed. He was in France when the next sighting was recorded, a small village in Provence, where the people were still recovering from the plague and looking for someone to blame. He had stopped to draw water from a well, and a woman had seen him. She had screamed, pointed, called him a demon. He had walked away, but not fast enough. The village priest had written it all down, a careful account in his parish register. A stranger came to the well. He was tall and dark, with eyes that held no light. He did not sicken when all around him sickened. He did not die when all around him died. I asked him his name, and he said nothing. I asked him whence he came, and he pointed east. I believe he may be the one they call the Wandering Jew, cursed by our Lord to walk until the end of time. I prayed over him, but he did not respond. He simply walked on. The wanderer heard about this account years later from a traveling merchant who had seen a copy. He had smiled, a small, sad smile. The priest had been wrong about many things, but right about one. He had simply walked on. He walked into the rising light of the Renaissance, when the world rediscovered beauty and began to question everything. He stood in the piazzas of Florence, listening to philosophers debate the nature of the soul. He watched artists paint visions of heaven that made the cathedrals seem dim. He heard musicians create sounds that had never existed before, sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the world. And he wondered, sometimes, if the one he waited for would return in such a time, if he would walk through the arches of some great city and find him there, waiting, smiling, saying enough. But he never did. The centuries continued to pile up. The 1300s became the 1400s, became the 1500s. The world grew larger, or seemed to. Ships sailed west and found lands no one had imagined. The old certainties cracked and crumbled. The church, which had stood for 1,000 years as the unshakable center of everything, split apart. He walked through the wars of religion, when Christian killed Christian with a fervor they had once reserved for infidel. He stood in cities under siege, watching the flames rise, listening to the scream. He pulled bodies from rubble, held the hands of the dying, whispered words of comfort in languages that had not existed when he first began to walk. And always, always, he walked on. In the 1500s, a German scholar named Chrysostomus Julius published a pamphlet claiming to have met the wandering Jew in Hamburg. He described him as a man of sorrowful appearance, dressed in ragged clothes, who spoke of events from the time of Christ as if he had witnessed them himself. The pamphlet sold thousands of copies. It was translated into multiple languages. The legend was no longer a whisper in the margins of chronicles. It was a sensation. The wanderer heard about it, of course. He could not avoid hearing about it. Everywhere he went, people asked if he was the one. Everywhere he went, he denied it and moved on. But the denial was itself a kind of confirmation. The more he denied, the more they believed. He learned to live with it, to accept that he was no longer just a man walking through history. He was a symbol, a story, a myth made flesh. The real man, the cobbler from Jerusalem, the one who had spoken harsh words on a dusty road, was fading, even in his own memory. He was becoming Ahasuerus. He was becoming the wandering Jew. One night in a tavern in the Low Countries, he sat in a corner and listened to a storyteller recite his own legend. The man was good, his voice rising and falling with the drama of the tale. He told of the moment on the Via Dolorosa, the curse, the endless walking. He described the wanderer's appearance, tall, dark, with eyes that held the sorrow of ages. He listed the cities where he had been seen, the miracles attributed to him, the warnings he had given to those who crossed his path. The crowd listened, rapt. They gasped at the right moment. They crossed themselves when the storyteller described the curse. When it was over, they passed a hat for coins, and the wanderer added his own small contribution. The storyteller noticed, nodded his thanks, and moved on. No one looked twice at the quiet man in the corner. No one saw the tears that stood in his eyes, unshed, as he listened to the story of his own life told by a stranger who had never met him. He left the tavern and walked into the night. The stars were out, cold and distant. The road stretched before him, pale in the moonlight. He thought about the storyteller, about the crowd, about the thousands of people who would hear that tale and carry it in their hearts. They would never know the real man. They would never know the small, ordinary moments, the taste of water from a gourd, the warmth of a fire in an old man's house, the weight of a child in his arm. They would know only the legend, the symbol, the curse. And perhaps he thought that was enough. Perhaps that was all he was meant to be. A story, a warning, a strange kind of comfort for those who feared death, proving that death was not the worst thing that could happen to a soul. He walked on, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the road unwound before him like a thread leading through the labyrinth of time. Behind him, in the tavern, the storyteller was already gathering a new crowd, ready to tell the tale again. The legend was spreading, growing, taking on a life of its own. And somewhere in the darkness, between one step and the next, the wanderer allowed himself to smile. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. He was not alone. He had never been alone. He walked with the memory of every face he had ever loved, every kindness he had ever received, every moment of grace he had ever witnessed. And now, he walked with something else. He walked with the story of himself, told by strangers who would never know his name. It was not rest, it was not the end of the road, but it was something. He held it close as he walked into the dawn, a small warmth against the endless cold of eternity. The cathedral bells had fallen silent behind him, lost in the distance. But ahead, new bells were waiting, new cities, new centuries, new faces to remember. And somewhere, at the end of all roads, a promise. Until I return. He walked toward it as he had always walked, one step at a time. And the legend walked with him. The world was learning to read. Not the scholars, not the monks, not the wealthy few who had always possessed letters. Everyone, or nearly everyone, the great machine of the printing press was churning out pages by the thousands, by the millions, and those pages were finding their way into hands that had never held a book before. The wanderer watched this transformation with something like wonder. He had seen empires rise and fall, plagues sweep across continents, wars reshape the map of the known world. But this was different. This was quiet. This was a revolution that happened in workshops and taverns, in the flickering light of candles held by people who were learning, for the first time, that their stories mattered. He walked through the cities of Germany in the early 1600s, and everywhere he went, he saw his own face staring back at him. Not literally, not in portraits or paintings, but in words. In the cheap pamphlets that hung from stalls in every market square, their pages coarse and uneven, their woodcut illustrations crude but unmistakable. A figure in ancient robes, a staff in his hand, a look of eternal sorrow on his face. Ahasuerus, the wandering Jew, the man who didn't die. He bought one once just to see. It cost a few pfennigs, less than a loaf of bread. He took it to a quiet corner and read it by the light of a fading sun. The story was his, and it was not his. The details were wrong or rearranged or invented whole cloth. The cobbler in the pamphlet was a shoemaker in Jerusalem, yes, but he was also cruel, mocking, a man who deserved his fate. He had struck Christ, the pamphlet said, had pushed him, spat on him, laughed as he fell. The wanderer closed the pamphlet and stared at the wall of the building across the alley. He did not remember striking anyone. He did not remember spitting or laughing. He remembered only the irritation, the muttered words, the look in those eyes. But the story did not care about his memory. The story had its own truth now, its own momentum. It was no longer about what had happened. It was about what people needed to believe. He kept the pamphlet. He carries it still, somewhere in the folds of his memory, along with all the others. The 1600s were the great age of his legend. Pamphlet after pamphlet poured from the presses, each one claiming to be the true account of an encounter with the wandering Jew. He had been seen in Hamburg, in Lübeck, in Prague, in Vienna. He had been seen in Paris and London and Madrid. He had spoken to bishops and kings and peasants, dispensing wisdom or warnings depending on the teller's purpose. In 1602, a pamphlet appeared in Germany that would become the template for all the others. It claimed to be the testimony of Paulus von Eitzen, a bishop who had met the wandering Jew in Hamburg in 1542. The bishop had spoken with him at length, the pamphlet said, and had recorded his words for posterity. The wanderer had told of his wanderings, of the cities he had seen, of the faith he still held despite his curse. He had wept when he spoke of Christ, the pamphlet said, had begged for prayers, had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The wanderer read this pamphlet decades after its publication in a borrowed copy that was falling apart from use. He read it and marveled at the skill of the writer. The words attributed to him were beautiful, moving, exactly what people wanted to hear. He wished he had said them. He wished he had been that eloquent, that wise. But he had not been in Hamburg in 1542. He had been in France that year, walking through villages still recovering from the latest round of wars. He had not met any bishops. He had not wept and begged for prayers. He had simply walked, as he always walked, unnoticed and alone. And yet the pamphlet was true in a way that facts could never capture. It was true to the legend. It was true to what he had become. The man in the pamphlet was not him, but he was also, somehow, more than him. He was the wanderer that the world needed. He walked on. The pamphlets followed him, spreading across Europe like seeds on the wind. In England, they called him the Wandering Jew. In France, Le Juif Errant. In Italy, El Ebrio Errante. The name changed, but the story remained the same. A man cursed to walk until the end of time, a witness to the passion, a living reminder of the cost of cruelty. And beneath the story, always the question that every reader asked themselves, alone in the night, with only a candle and a pamphlet for company. What would I do if I could not die? The wanderer asked himself that question too sometime. He still did not have an answer. He was in a city in the Low Countries when he saw something new, a play, a group of actors performing the story of his life in a public square. He stood at the back of the crowd, watching as a man in a robe and a false beard staggered across the stage, condemned to walk forever. The crowd laughed, they cheered, they wept at the right moments. When the play ended, they applauded and went home to their dinners and their beds. The wanderer stayed in the square long after they had gone, looking at the empty stage, the rough wooden planks, the painted backdrop showing a street in Jerusalem. He had become entertainment, a story to be consumed and forgotten, a night's diversion. It should have hurt, perhaps it did hurt, in a place so deep he could not feel it anymore. But mostly, he felt nothing, only the familiar weight of his own endurance, the endless accumulation of years that had worn away the sharp edges of every emotion. He turned and walked away from the square, away from the city, toward the open road. Behind him, the actors were already packing up their props, loading them onto a cart, preparing to move to the next town. They would perform the play again tomorrow, for a new crowd in a new place. The story would never stop. It would never grow tired. It would never die. Unlike him, he walked on, and the night swallowed him, and the pages of the never-ending book continued to turn. The 17th century deepened around him like a long, dark winter. He walked through the 30 Years' War, when Germany tore itself apart and the bodies piled up like cordwood in every field. He walked through fields where the only sound was the cawing of crows and the only movement was the twitching of limbs not yet still. He walked through villages where the survivors were too few to bury the dead, where children wandered alone, their eyes blank with a horror too deep for tears. He helped where he could. He always helped. He carried water to the dying, held the hands of the frightened, whispered words of comfort in languages that were themselves dying, replaced by new tongues that would one day die in their turn. But there were too many. There were always too many. One night he sat by a fire with a group of refugees, peasants who had lost everything, who were walking toward some imagined safety that did not exist. They shared what little food they had. They huddled together for warmth, and one of them, an old woman with eyes like burned holes in a blanket, looked at him and spoke. "You have the look," she said, "the look of someone who has seen too much." He did not answer. He did not need to. "I had a son," she continued. "He was killed last year by soldiers. They said he was hiding food. He was hiding nothing. He was just a boy." She paused, her voice catching. "I pray every night that he is in heaven, that he is at peace, that he does not have to see what the world has become." The wanderer looked into the fire. The flames danced and shifted, consuming the wood, turning it to ash. "He is at peace," he said quietly. "Death is peace. Death is rest. Death is the gift that keeps on giving." The old woman looked at him strangely, but she did not ask what he meant. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps, in her grief, she understood that there were worse things than dying. In the morning, they went their separate ways. She toward the west, toward hope. He toward the east, toward nothing. He walked on. In 1642, a new pamphlet appeared. This one was different from the others. It claimed that the wandering Jew had been seen in London, that he had spoken with a Puritan divine, that he had predicted great upheavals and the downfall of kings. The pamphlet sold like fire in dry grass. England was already tense, already trembling on the edge of civil war. The wanderer's prophecy, if it could be called that, added fuel to the flame. He was not in London in 1642. He was in the countryside, walking through fields that would soon be battlefields, watching the clouds gather. But the pamphlet did not care about his actual location. The pamphlet had its own geography, its own timeline. In the world of print, the wanderer could be everywhere at once. He could speak to everyone simultaneously. He could be whatever the readers needed him to be. He learned to live with this, to accept it, to even, in a strange way, find comfort in it. The legend was no longer his burden alone. It belonged to the world now. The world would carry it for him. In the 1660s, he found himself in Amsterdam. The city was a marvel, a place of canals and commerce, of religious tolerance and intellectual ferment. Jews who had fled the Inquisition found refuge here, building a new life in a new land. The wanderer walked through their quarter, listening to the languages he remembered from his earliest days: Hebrew, Aramaic, the Ladino of the exile. He entered a small synagogue, drawn by the sound of chanting. Inside, a handful of men prayed in the fading light, their voices rising and falling in patterns older than most of the buildings in this city. He stood at the back, listening, remembering. After the service, an old man approached him. He was a rabbi, his beard white, his eyes sharp with intelligence. "You are a stranger here," the rabbi said. "I have not seen you before." "I am passing through," the wanderer replied. The rabbi studied him for a long moment. "You have the look of someone who has been passing through for a very long time." The wanderer said nothing. "There are stories," the rabbi continued, lowering his voice. "Stories of a man who walks, a man who cannot die. Some say he is a curse upon our people. Some say he is a blessing, a witness, a reminder that we are not alone in our wandering." The wanderer met his eyes. "What do you say?" The rabbi was silent for a moment, considering. Then he smiled, a small, sad smile. "I say that we are all wanderers, all of us. Exile is not a punishment. It is our condition. It is what it means to be human, to be always walking towards something we cannot see, always hopping for a home we have not yet found." He paused. "If there is a man who walks forever, he is not cursed. He is simply the most human of us all." The wanderer felt something shift inside him, a small movement, like a stone turning in a slow river. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. He left the synagogue and walked through the streets of Amsterdam, past the canals and the bridges, past the houses with their stepped gables and their gleaming windows. The city was beautiful, full of light and life, but he could not stay. He never could. At the edge of the city, he stopped and looked back. The sun was setting, painting the canals in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere behind him, the rabbi was probably telling his congregation about the stranger who had visited, the man with the sad eyes who had said nothing and everything. Another story, another sighting, another page in the never-ending book. He turned and walked on, toward the open country, toward the next city, toward the next century. The book would continue without him. It would grow and change and multiply, spawning new editions, new translations, new interpretations. It would become a thing unto itself, a living entity that fed on the imaginations of millions. And he would continue too, walking, remembering, waiting. The pages turned, and the road stretched on, and the man who didn't die walked between them both, a figure caught forever in the space between story and truth. The 18th century arrived with a new sound. Not bells this time, not the clash of swords or the cries of the dying. A different sound, the sound of ideas colliding, of old certainties cracking, of minds opening like windows to let in a light that had been shut out for 1,000 years. He walked through the age of enlightenment, and the world felt different under his feet, lighter, somehow, as if the stones themselves had grown less weighty. In Paris, he stood in the shadows of cafes where philosophers argued about reason and rights, about the nature of government and the soul. They spoke of progress, of improvement, of the perfectibility of man. They believed that the future would be better than the past, that knowledge would save them, that they could build a world without superstition and fear. He listened, and he wondered if they were right. He had seen so much darkness. Perhaps the light was finally coming. Perhaps the long night was ending. But he had also seen too much to believe in easy answers. He had watched the sun rise over too many battlefields, too many ruins, too many graves. The light always came, but the darkness always returned. It was the rhythm of the world. The only constant was the walking. In 1721, a new version of his story appeared. This time it was not a pamphlet but a book, a real book, with a leather binding and pages that were meant to last. The title was Kurzbeschreibung und Erzählung von einem Juden mit Namen Ahasuerus, a short description and account of a Jew with the name Ahasuerus. It gathered together all the previous sightings, all the previous stories, and presented them as a continuous narrative. The wanderer held a copy in his hands, years later, in a library in Leipzig. He turned the pages slowly, reading about himself as if he were a character in someone else's dream. The book was wrong about so many things, but it was also right in ways that surprised him. The writer had captured something, the loneliness, the weight of memory, the strange, enduring hope that flickered in the darkness of his heart. He closed the book and returned it to its shelf. The librarian, a young man with spectacles and an eager expression, noticed him. "You have an interest in the legend?" the librarian asked. "I have an interest in stories," the wanderer replied. The librarian nodded. "This is a famous one. Some say it is true, some say it is a fable. I myself am uncertain." He paused, then added, "Would you like to see something interesting?" He led the wanderer to a back room, where older books were stored, manuscripts from centuries past, their pages fragile, their bindings crumbling. He pulled one down and opened it carefully. "This is from the 13th century, he said, "a chronicle from a monastery in England, written by a monk named Matthew Paris." He pointed to a passage. "Here, he writes of an Armenian bishop who visited England and told of meeting the wandering Jew. The bishop said the man's name was Cartaphilus, that he was a doorkeeper in Pilate's hall, that he struck Christ and was condemned to wait until the return." The wanderer looked at the ancient page, at the careful script, at the words that had been written more than 400 years before. Cartaphilus, a name he had never claimed, a story he had never told, and yet there it was, preserved in ink, waiting for him across the centuries. "The bishop claimed to have eaten with him," the librarian continued. "He said the man was grave and holy, that he wept when he spoke of the passion, that he lived on bread and water, and the hope of forgiveness." He looked up at the wanderer. "What do you think? Do you believe such a man exists?" The wanderer looked from the page to the librarian's eager face. He could see the hunger there, the hunger for wonder, for mystery, for something beyond the ordinary world of books and facts. It was the same hunger that had driven people to buy the pamphlets, to attend the plays, to tell and retell the story across the century. "I think," he said slowly, "that the truth is not always the same as what happened. Sometimes the truth is what we need to believe. And if a man like that existed, if he walked among us, bearing witness to all we have done and all we have suffered, then perhaps he would not be a curse. Perhaps he would be a gift, a reminder that we are seen, that we are remembered, that we matter." The librarian stared at him, his eyes wide. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of suspicion. But the wanderer did not give him time to ask the question forming on his lips. He nodded, thanked the librarian for his time, and walked out of the library into the streets of Leipzig. The sun was setting, painting the city in shades of amber and rose. He walked through the market square, past the stalls that were closing for the day, past the students heading home from their lectures, past the ordinary people living their ordinary lives. They did not see him. They never did. But he saw them. He saw the young couple holding hands, the mother chasing a child, the old man sitting on a bench, feeding crumbs to the pigeon. He saw their joy and their sorrow, their hope and their fear. He saw the brief, beautiful flare of their lives against the darkness of eternity. And he carried them with him as he carried everyone. Another face in the vast congregation behind his eyes. Another memory to warm himself against the cold. He left Leipzig by the eastern gate, walking into the gathering dusk. The road stretched before him, pale and endless. The stars began to emerge, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds waiting to be planted. He thought about the librarian, about the manuscript, about the bishop who had claimed to eat with Cartaphilus. He thought about all the stories that had been told about him, all the names he had been given, all the lives he had touched without ever meaning to. And he thought about the question the librarian had asked, "Do you believe such a man exists?" The answer was yes. Of course, yes, he existed. He was walking at that very moment, his feet pressing into the soil of a world that would never know his name. But the man in the stories, the holy man, the weeping witness, the prophet of doom, did that man exist? He was not sure. That man was a creation of the human imagination, a figure shaped by hope and fear and the endless human need for meaning. Perhaps in the end, that man was more real than he was. Perhaps the legend would outlive him as it had already outlived empires and ages. Perhaps, when the last day came and he finally stopped walking, the story would continue without him, walking on forever through the minds of those who had never seen his face. The thought was strange and sad and strangely comforting. He walked on, and the pages of the never-ending book turned behind him, and the legend grew with every step he took. In 100 years, they would write new stories about him. In 200 years, they would make him a character in novels and poems. In 300 years, they would search for him with cameras and recording devices, hoping to capture proof of his existence. He knew none of this. He only knew the road, the night, the endless rhythm of his own footsteps. But somewhere in the deepest part of him, a small flame still burned, a hope that had survived centuries of darkness, a belief that the one who had spoken to him on that dusty road would keep his promise. "Until I return." He walked toward that promise as he had always walked, and the pages continued to turn. The air in the study was thick with dust and desire, not the ordinary desire of the flesh, but something rarer, the desire to know, the desire to transcend, the desire to reach beyond the limits of mortal flesh and touch the face of God. The wanderer stood in the doorway, watching the old man work. He had not meant to come here. He had been walking through the city, Prague, in the year 1784, when a rainstorm had driven him into the nearest shelter. That shelter happened to be the entrance to a narrow building in the Jewish quarter, and that building happened to contain a scholar who had spent his entire life searching for one thing: immortality. The old man did not notice him at first. He was bent over a table cluttered with glass vessels and brass instruments, his fingers trembling as he measured powders into a crucible. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the room seem larger than it was, full of hidden corners and watching eyes. The wanderer watched him for a long time. He had seen men like this before, in every century, in every country, men who could not accept that death was the end, men who spent their lives searching for the secret that would let them live forever. They never found it, they could not find it. The secret was not in any book, not in any formula, not in any combination of elements. The secret was walking toward them, standing in their doorways, watching them with eyes that had seen 2,000 years. But they never saw him. They were too busy looking elsewhere. The old man finally noticed him. He started, nearly dropping the crucible, his eyes wide with alarm. "Who are you? How did you get in?" "The door was open," the wanderer said. It was not quite true, but it was not quite a lie. The door had been unlocked. In Prague, in this quarter, that was the same as open. The old man relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "You are a stranger here. I know every face in this quarter. Yours I do not know. I am passing through. The rain drove me inside." The old man looked toward the window, where the rain was still streaming down the glass. He nodded, as if this explanation satisfied some internal test. "Then you are welcome to wait out the storm, but be silent. I am working." He turned back to his table, dismissing the wanderer from his attention. The wanderer moved into the room, finding a chair in the shadows near the door. He sat, and he watched, and he waited. The old man worked with the intensity of the obsessed. He measured and mixed, heated and cooled, muttered incantations in languages that had not been spoken in centuries. The room filled with strange smells, sulfur, mercury, something sweet that might have been honey or might have been something far stranger. Hours passed, the rain continued, the fire burned low. Finally, the old man sat back, his face sagging with exhaustion and disappointment. The mixture in the crucible had turned black, then cracked, then crumbled into useless powder. "Nothing," he whispered, "nothing again, after 40 years, nothing." The wanderer spoke from the shadows. "What are you looking for?" The old man turned, seeming almost surprised to find him still there. "What am I looking for? The greatest prize in all of creation, the thing that kings have died for and popes have prayed for. I am looking for the elixir of life, the fountain of youth, the thing that will let me live forever. And you think you can find it in a crucible, in a formula?" The old man's eyes flashed with anger. "It is not a matter of thinking, it is a matter of knowing. The ancients knew, Hermes Trismegistus, Paracelsus, they knew the secret. It is written in the stars, in the elements, in the very fabric of creation. All I have to do is find the key." The wanderer said nothing. He simply sat in the shadows, his face invisible, his presence a weight in the room. The old man studied him, his anger fading into something else. Curiosity, interest. "You speak strangely," he said, "as if you come from somewhere else, somewhere far away." "I have traveled." "Where?" The wanderer considered the question. How could he answer? Where had he traveled? Everywhere, nowhere. The list was too long, the geography too vast. "East," he said finally, "and west, north and south. I have seen many things." The old man moved closer, peering at him in the dim light. "You have a strange look about you, as if you have seen things that cannot be unseen." He paused, his eyes narrowing, "as if you have lived a very long time." The wanderer met his gaze. "Perhaps I have." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, a question, a possibility. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. "There are stories of a man who walks, a man who cannot die. They say he was there at the beginning. They say he saw him, spoke to him, was cursed by him." He leaned closer, his breath quickening. "Are you that man?" The wanderer did not answer. He did not need to. The silence was answer enough. The old man sank onto a stool, his legs giving way beneath him. His face was a chaos of emotions, awe, fear, hope, disbelief. "All my life," he whispered, "all my life I have searched for immortality. And you have it, you are it, you are living proof that it exists." The wanderer shook his head slowly. "I am not proof of what you seek. I am proof of something else entirely, something you would not want." "How can you say that? You have eternal life. You will never die. That is everything I have worked for, everything I have dreamed of." The wanderer rose from the chair and moved into the light. For the first time, the old man saw his face clearly, the lines around his eyes, the depth of his gaze, the weight of centuries visible in every feature. "I have eternal life," the wanderer said quietly, "and I would trade it all for a single day of the life you have, a single day of mortality, a single day of knowing that this breath might be my last, that this moment matters, that there is an end waiting to give meaning to the beginning." The old man stared at him, his mouth open, his dreams crumbling like the powder in his crucible. "You do not understand," he whispered. "You cannot understand. You have what I want. How can you not want it too?" The wanderer looked at him with something like pity. "Because I have lived long enough to know that the only thing worse than dying is never being allowed to stop." The rain had stopped. The room was silent, except for the crackling of the dying fire. The wanderer moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at the old man, still sitting on his stool, still staring, still trying to comprehend. "Keep searching," he said. "It is a noble thing to want to live. But remember this, the elixir you seek is not in any formula. It is in the moments, the small moments, the taste of bread, the warmth of a fire, the face of someone you love. Those are the only immortality any of us are meant to have." He opened the door and stepped out into the night. Behind him, the old man sat alone in his study, surrounded by his failed experiments and his shattered dream. He would search for the rest of his life. He would never find what he sought. But he would remember, until his dying day, the stranger who had come in from the rain and shown him the face of eternal life. It was not a face of joy. It was a face of sorrow, so deep it could fill ocean. And in that sorrow, the old man saw something he had never seen before. The value of his own mortality, the gift of his own end. The wanderer left Prague as he had entered it, on foot, alone at dawn. The city fell away behind him, its spires and bridges fading into the morning mist. He walked east, though east meant nothing anymore. Every direction was the same. Every road led to the same place, nowhere. But the encounter with the alchemist had stirred something in him, a memory, a question, a thread of thought that wound through the centuries like a river through a desert. Immortality. Everyone wanted it. They always had. The alchemists with their crucibles, the conquerors with their empires, the poets with their verses, all reaching for something beyond the grave, something that would let them last. And he had it. He was it. He was the thing they all sought. He was also the thing they would all flee if they knew the truth. The road took him through countryside that was slowly waking to spring. Trees were beginning to bud, their branches traced with the faintest green. Birds sang in the hedgerows. Farmers guided plows through fields still wet with rain. Life renewing itself as it always did, as it always would. He walked among them, invisible, unknown, a ghost in broad daylight. In a village somewhere in Bohemia, he stopped at a tavern to rest his feet and drink a cup of water. The place was crowded with travelers and locals, the air thick with smoke and conversation. He found a corner, sat with his back to the wall, and listened. The talk was of many things: crops, prices, the latest news from Vienna, but one topic dominated all others: the revolution. Not the one that had already happened in America, though that was mentioned too, the one that was brewing in France. The one that everyone could feel coming, like the pressure before a storm. They say the king is finished, a merchant was saying. They say the people of Paris have risen up, that they've taken the Bastille, that they're marching on Versailles. Good riddance, another man muttered. The nobles have bled us dry long enough. Let them feel the blade for a chain. Careful, an older man warned. Talk like that can get you hanged or starved. What's the difference? The wanderer listened, and he remembered. He had seen revolutions before. He had seen the French one coming in a way, though he did not know its shape. He had seen the pattern repeat itself over and over for nearly 2,000 years. The oppressed rising against the oppressor, the blood flowing, the new order that was always, eventually, just as corrupt as the old. He finished his water and left the tavern, walking on toward the west. He reached Paris in the autumn of 1793. The city was a cauldron, bubbling with rage and fear, and the intoxicating drug of absolute freedom. The streets ran with rhetoric and, increasingly, with blood. The guillotine stood in the Place de la Révolution, its blade falling day after day, harvesting heads like a farmer harvesting wheat. He walked among the crowds that gathered to watch the execution. He saw the faces of the condemned, nobles and priests, but also ordinary people now, anyone who had crossed the wrong faction or spoken the wrong words. He saw them climb the steps, their faces pale, their hands bound. He saw the blade fall. He saw the baskets fill. And he saw something else, something that made him pause. A woman in the crowd, young, perhaps 30, with dark hair and eyes that burned with a fire he had seen before. She watched the executions not with horror, but with ecstasy. Her lips moved as the blade fell, forming words he could not hear but could guess. Prayer, curse, celebration. It was impossible to tell. He moved closer, drawn by something he did not understand. The woman turned, as if sensing his gaze. Their eyes met, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw recognition in her face. Not of him, not of who he was, but of something, a kindred spirit, another soul who had seen too much. Then the moment passed. She turned away, lost in the crowd, and he let her go. He wandered through the city as the terror deepened. He saw the churches closed, their altars desecrated, their statues smashed. He saw the new religion of reason celebrated in festivals that felt hollow and desperate. He saw the faces of the hungry, the frightened, the condemned. And he thought about the alchemist in Prague, about his search for immortality, about his belief that eternal life was the greatest gift imaginable. What would the alchemist make of this? The wanderer wondered. What would he think of a world where death had become a spectacle, where the blade fell and fell and fell, where life was cheaper than bread? He found a room in a poor quarter, a garret beneath the eaves of a crumbling building. The woman who rented it to him asked no questions. She was too tired, too frightened, too focused on survival. She took his coin and gave him a key and forgot him before he climbed the stairs. At night, he sat by the small window and looked out over the city. He could hear the drums in the distance, the rumble of carts, the occasional scream. Paris was a city possessed, dancing on the edge of an abyss. One night, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find the woman from the crowd, the one with the burning eyes. She stood in the dim light of the corridor, her face pale, her hands trembling. "You," she said, "I saw you at the executions. I saw you watching." He nodded. "I watch many things." She pushed past him into the room, her eyes darting around the bare space. "They are coming for me. I have to hide. They will search the usual places, the houses of my friends. They will not think to look here." He closed the door. "Who is coming for you?" "The committee, the revolutionaries. I am a royalist. My brother was an aristocrat. He died last week under the blade. Now they want me too." He looked at her fine bones, her educated speech, the way she held herself despite her fear. She was not of his world, not of his time, but she was human, and she was afraid, and he had spent 2,000 years responding to that fear in the only way he knew. "Sit," he said. "Rest. I will keep watch." She looked at him strangely. "You do not know me. I could be anyone. I could be lying." "You are not lying. How do you know?" He did not answer. He simply moved to the window and looked out at the street below, his back to her, his presence a wall between her and the night. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, her breath slowly steadying. "Why are you helping me?" she asked after a long silence. "Because I can. That is not a reason." He turned to look at her. "It is the only reason that matters." She studied him in the faint light from the window. "You are strange. You look like a man, but you do not move like one. You move like something else, like someone who has been moving for a very long time." He said nothing. "My nurse used to tell me stories," she continued, her voice soft, almost dreamy. "Stories of a man who could not die, a man who walked the earth waiting for the end of the world. She said he had been there at the crucifixion, that he had seen Christ die, that he was cursed to walk until Christ returned." She paused. "I used to have nightmares about him, about a face at the window watching me, old and sad and endless." He moved away from the window, into the shadows where she could not see him clearly. "And now?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Now I think I would like to meet him, to ask him what it is like, to live so long, to see so much, to lose everyone." "You would not like the answer." "How do you know?" He did not answer, but something in the silence must have told her what she needed to know. She drew in a sharp breath, her eyes widening in the darkness. "It is you," she whispered. "It is really you." He did not confirm. He did not deny. He simply stood in the shadows waiting. She rose from the bed and moved toward him, her hand reaching out as if to touch him, to prove he was real. But at the last moment, she stopped. Her hand hovered in the air between them, trembling. "You are real," she breathed. "All the stories, all the legends, you are real." "I am tired," he said. "That is all I am, tired and walking." She let her hand fall. "Then let me give you something. A moment of rest, a moment of peace." She gestured to the room, the bed, the small window. "Stay here tonight. Let me watch for you for once. Let me be the one who keeps guard." He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, yes, but also at something else. Kindness, gratitude, a desire to give something back to the stranger who had opened his door. "No one has ever offered that before," he said. "Then let me be the first." He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the floor beside him, her back against the wall. They did not speak. They simply watched the night together, two souls caught in the vast machinery of history, finding a moment of stillness in the storm. In the morning, she was gone. She had left before dawn, slipping out as silently as she had arrived. He did not know if she survived the terror. He never saw her again. But he remembered her. He remembered her face, her voice, her offer. He remembered the warmth of her presence in the darkness. Another face for the congregation behind his eyes. Another moment of grace to carry through the centuries. He left Paris as the terror reached its peak, walking south toward the mountains, toward the silence. Behind him, the blade continued to fall. But he carried something with him that the blade could not touch. A small warmth, a brief flicker of human kindness in the endless night. It was enough. It had to be enough. He walked on. The mountains received him like a confession. He walked south from Paris, through countryside that slowly rose and roughened, until the flat fields gave way to foothills, and the foothills gave way to peaks. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The sounds of human violence faded, replaced by the older sounds, wind through pines, water over stone, the cry of hawks circling above. He walked into Switzerland, into the silence of the Alps. The mountains were old, older than him, older than the story that had swallowed him. They had watched glaciers come and go, had felt the slow grind of ice against stone, had stood in patient witness while empires rose and crumbled like sandcastles beneath their gaze. He found a path that led upward, away from villages, away from people, away from everything. He followed it for days, climbing into a realm where the only sounds were the wind and his own breathing. At the tree line, he stopped. Below him, the world spread out like a map. Valleys and rivers, forests and fields, tiny villages with their tiny churches, their tiny lives. From this height, it all looked so small, so brief, so beautiful. He sat on a rock and watched the sun set over the peaks. The light turned gold, then rose, then purple, then faded into the deep blue of approaching night. Stars emerged, one by one, until the sky was thick with them, more stars than he had seen in centuries. He had forgotten. In the cities, in the crowds, in the endless press of humanity, he had forgotten what silence felt like, what solitude felt like, what it meant to be alone with nothing but his own thoughts and the vast indifference of the universe. He stayed on the mountain for a time, days, weeks, he did not count. He found a small hut, used by shepherds in the summer, empty now in the autumn. He sheltered there, building fires, eating what little he could find, berries, roots, the occasional fish from a stream. And he thought about the alchemist in Prague, searching for immortality in his crucibles. He thought about the woman in Paris, fleeing the blade, offering him a night of peace. He thought about all the faces, all the lives, all the brief, bright flames he had watched flicker and die. He thought about himself. Who was he now, after 2,000 years? After countless names and countless sightings, after becoming a legend while still walking the earth? Who was the man who sat on this mountain, watching the stars? He did not know. The answer had been eroded by time, worn away like a stone in a river. There were memories, yes, thousands of them, millions of them, but they were not him. They were just things that had happened to him, the self that had experienced them, that had been someone else, someone who had died long ago on a dusty road in Jerusalem when a pair of eyes had looked into his and spoken words that changed everything. He was a collection of memories now, a walking archive, a library with no readers. Except himself, he was the reader. He was the only one who would ever read the book of his own life, page by endless page, until the end of time. On the mountain, in the silence, he began to write, not with ink and paper, but with memory. He went back to the beginning, to the streets of Jerusalem, to the shop with its smell of leather and nails. He tried to remember his mother's face. He could not. It was gone, lost in the fog of centuries. He tried to remember the name he had been given at birth, gone too. But he remembered the feel of leather in his hands. He remembered the rhythm of hammer on awl. He remembered the satisfaction of a well-made shoe, the gratitude of a customer, the simple pride of work done well. That perhaps was who he still was, a maker, a craftsman, someone who took raw materials and shaped them into something useful, something beautiful. He looked at his hands. They were the same hands that had held that all 2,000 years ago, unchanged, unaging, still capable of the same work. He found a piece of wood on the mountain, a fallen branch smoothed by wind and weather. He took out his knife, the same knife he had carried for centuries, its blade worn thin but still sharp, and began to carve. He did not know what he was making. He let his hands guide him, let the memory of muscle and bone shape the wood. Hours passed, days. The carving grew under his fingers, taking form, becoming something. When it was finished, he held it in his palm and looked at it. A face, not his face, not any face he remembered, but a face. The face of a man, worn and weary, with eyes that looked toward something in the distance. A face that held sorrow and hope in equal measure. A face that could have been anyone and everyone. He set the carving on a rock, facing east, toward Jerusalem. It was not a prayer. He had forgotten how to pray. It was something else, a marker, a sign, a reminder that he had been here, on this mountain, in this moment, still human enough to create something with his hand. He stayed on the mountain through the winter. The snow came, deep and white, burying the world in silence. He had enough food stored, enough wood for the fire. He carved more faces, more figures, populating the hut with a silent congregation of wood and memory. When spring came, melting the snow and revealing the first green shoots, he left. He walked down from the mountain, back into the world. The carving of the face remained, sitting on its rock, facing east. Perhaps some shepherd would find it, years later, and wonder who had made it. Perhaps it would rot, return to the earth, become nothing. It did not matter. What mattered was that he had made it, that he had remembered for a moment who he was. The road welcomed him back, as it always did. It stretched before him, patient and endless, waiting for his feet. He walked into the 19th century, into a world that was changing faster than ever. Trains would soon slice through the countryside, carrying people at speeds he could not match on foot. Telegraphs would send messages across continents in moments. Photographs would capture faces and hold them still, defying time in a way he never could. He walked through all of it, a ghost in the machine of progress. He saw the first photographs, the first trains, the first electric lights. He saw cities grow and change, swallowing the countryside, reaching toward the sky. And everywhere he went, he heard his own name, Ahasuerus, the wandering Jew, the man who didn't die. The legend had become a phenomenon. Poets wrote about him, Shelley, Wordsworth, Goethe. Composers set his story to music. Artists painted his face, imagining what he must look like, giving him features that were never his own. He became, in the 19th century, a symbol of exile, of endurance, of the human condition itself. And he walked on. One evening, in a city he did not bother to name, he passed a theater. A crowd was gathering, dressed in their finest, eager for entertainment. A poster outside announced the evening's performance, Le Juif Errant, a new play based on the legend. He stood at the back of the crowd, watching them file in. They were laughing, chatting, anticipating an evening of emotion and spectacle. They would watch his story unfold on stage, would weep at the right moments, would applaud at the end, and then they would go home and forget. He was not angry, he was not sad, he was simply present. The alchemist had wanted immortality. The woman in Paris had wanted safety. These people wanted entertainment, all of them reaching for something, grasping at shadow. He had stopped grasping long ago. He had learned to simply walk, to simply witness, to simply be. The theater doors closed. The performance began. Inside, an actor wearing a costume and a false beard portrayed his suffering for an audience that would never know the real thing. Outside, the real thing stood in the shadows, listening to the faint echo of applause. Then he turned and walked away into the night, toward the next city, the next century, the next page in the never-ending book. The philosopher's stone had never been found. The elixir of life had never been discovered. But the road went on. It always went on. And so did he. The legend had always been a man. This is what the wanderer realized one evening in the middle of the 19th century as he sat in a small church in the English countryside. The church was old, older than the village that surrounded it, its stones weathered by 1,000 years of rain and wind. He had come here to rest, to escape the rain, to sit in the silence that only old churches possess. And there, in a side chapel, he saw her. Not a real woman, a statue, carved from wood, painted once, but now faded to near invisibility. She knelt in an attitude of prayer, her hands clasped, her face lifted toward an altar that no longer existed. The figure was old, perhaps as old as the church itself, and she was labeled in letters so worn they were almost illegible. The Eternal Pilgrim. He stood before her for a long time, studying her face. It was not a beautiful face, not in the way of saints and angels. It was a human face, worn by sorrow, marked by time. The carver had given her eyes that seemed to look beyond the walls of the church, beyond the village, beyond everything. A woman, a wanderer, an eternal pilgrim. He had never considered that possibility. In all the centuries, in all the stories, the wanderer was always a man. Ahasuerus, Cartaphilus, the wandering Jew. The pronouns were masculine, the imagery male, the curse delivered to a man on a dusty road. But why? Why could a woman not receive the same sentence? Why could a mother not be condemned to outlive her children? He knelt before the statue, something he had not done in centuries. He did not pray, he simply looked and wondered. And as he looked, a story began to form in his mind, a story that had always existed somewhere in the shadows of the legend, the story of the woman who didn't die. She had many names in the scattered tales. In Germany, they whispered of the Juden, the eternal Jewess. In England, she was sometimes called Elizabeth or Judith or simply the wandering woman. Her story was never written down in the pamphlets, never performed on the stages. It lived in the spaces between the lines, in the quiet tales told by grandmothers to grandchildren, in the warnings mothers gave to daughter. Do not mock the suffering, do not turn away from pain, or you may end like her. The wanderer left the church as the rain stopped, but the statue stayed with him. He carried it in his mind, a question he had never thought to ask. He began to look for her. For the first time in centuries, he searched. Not with intention, not with hope. He simply kept his eyes open, his attention tuned to a different frequency, and slowly, over the years, he began to find traces. In a village in Bavaria, An old woman told him of a legend from her childhood, a woman who appeared at crossroads, offering guidance to lost travelers. She was always old, the woman said, but her eyes were young, and she never stayed in one place for more than a night. She was looking for something, the old woman said, or someone. My grandmother used to say she was looking for her children, the children she had outlived. In a town in France, a librarian showed him a manuscript from the 14th century. It contained a single page, torn from a larger work, describing a woman who had been seen in the Cathedral of Chartres. She was kneeling before the statue of the Virgin, weeping. When asked why she wept, she said, "I have seen too many mothers bury their sons. I have buried mine 1,000 times." The librarian shrugged. It is probably fiction, a moral tale. They were fond of those in the Middle Ages. Perhaps, the wanderer said, but he took the description with him, adding it to the growing collection in his mind. In London, in the midst of the industrial clamor, he met a man who claimed to have seen her. He was old, a former sailor, now living in a charity hospital. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, but his voice was clear. "I saw her in India," he said, "years ago when I was a young man. We were camped near a village and she came out of the jungle. An old woman dressed in rags. She spoke to us in English, perfect English like a lady, asked if we had seen her daughter, said her daughter had been taken years ago by soldiers. She was still looking." "And you believed her?" The old sailor laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Believed her? I didn't know what to believe. But the captain, he was a religious man. He said she was the wandering Jewess. Said he'd heard stories about her from his own grandmother. We gave her food and let her go. She walked back into the jungle, alone, still calling for her daughter." The wanderer sat with the old man for a while, listening to the rain on the windows. Then he thanked him and left. He walked through the streets of London, past the factories and the tenements, past the beggars and the businessmen, past the thousands of lives being lived in their brief, intense flare. And he thought about her, the woman who didn't die, the mother who had outlived her children, the seeker who was still seeking after all these centuries. He wondered if she was real. He wondered if she was out there somewhere, walking a different road, carrying a different burden. He wondered if they had ever crossed paths without knowing it. Two wanderers, passing in the night, each too lost in their own sorrow to see the other. The thought was strangely comforting. If she existed, he was not alone. There was another soul condemned to walk, to watch, to remember. He looked up at the sky, gray with smoke and cloud. Somewhere out there, perhaps, she was looking at the same sky. He sent a thought toward her, a silent greeting across the mile. "Whoever you are, wherever you walk, I see you, I remember you, you are not alone." Then he walked on, into the fog, into the century, into the endless road. The search led him north, into the hills of Scotland. It was not a search with purpose. He did not have a map, a destination, a plan. He simply walked and let the stories guide him. A whisper here, a rumor there, an old woman in a crofter's cottage who spoke of a stranger who had passed through generations ago, a parish register that recorded an unknown woman, buried without a name, who had been found dead on the road with no sign of violence and no explanation for her presence. The trail was cold, centuries cold, but he followed it anyway, because following was what he did, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not an option. In the highlands, under a sky the color of pewter, he found a village that seemed to exist outside of time. The houses were stone and turf, the people few and wary. They looked at him with eyes that had learned, over generations, to trust no one. He asked about the legend. An old man, the oldest in the village, nodded slowly. He said, "I've heard the tale. My grandmother told it to me, and her grandmother told it to her. A woman who walks. They call her the Cailleach, the old woman. She's been seen in these parts for as long as anyone can remember." "What does she look like?" The old man squinted at the horizon. "Old, young, it depends on who sees her. Some say she's a hag, bent and withered. Others say she's a young woman, beautiful and sad. They say she changes. They say she's been walking so long that time doesn't hold her anymore." "And what does she want?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. "They say she's looking for her child, a daughter taken from her long ago. She walks the earth, searching, always searching, and she will not rest until she finds her." The wanderer felt something shift in his chest, a recognition, a kinship. Has anyone spoken to her? A few, they say she speaks in tongues no one can understand, or she speaks in perfect Gaelic, depending on the day. They say she asks the same question always, "Have you seen my daughter? She would be old now, very old, but I would know her." The old man shook his head. "It's a sad tale, a mother's grief stretched across eternity." The wanderer thanked him and walked on. He crossed into the mountains, following paths that were barely visible, climbing into mist and silence. The world grew smaller, simpler, just rock and sky and the sound of wind. And then, one evening, he saw her. She was standing on a ridge above him, silhouetted against the setting sun, a figure, small and alone, looking out over the vast landscape. He could not tell if she was old or young, beautiful or plain. She was simply there, a presence in the wilderness. He climbed toward her. The distance was greater than it looked, the terrain rough. By the time he reached the ridge, the sun had set and the light was fading fast. She was gone, but something remained, a small object lying on a rock where she had been standing. He picked it up. It was a carving, crude but somehow powerful, a figure of a woman, her arms outstretched, her face lifted toward the sky. He held it in his palm, feeling the warmth it had absorbed from the sun. Or perhaps the warmth was something else, something that came from her. He looked out over the landscape, darkening now, the first stars appearing. Somewhere out there she was walking as he walked, searching as he searched. He put the carving in his pocket and continued over the ridge, down into the next valley. He did not find her again, but he felt her presence, sometimes in the years that followed, a sense that he was not alone on the road, a flicker of awareness, like a candle in a distant window. And he carried her carving with him, a talisman, a reminder, the woman who didn't die, the mother who could not stop searching. She was real, she was out there, and perhaps one day, their roads would cross. He walked on, through the highlands, through the years, through the ever-accumulating weight of time. The carving remained in his pocket, warm against his thigh. A small comfort, a small hope. The road went on. The 20th century arrived with a roar. He felt it before he saw it, a vibration in the earth, a hum in the air, a quickening of the pulse of the world. Everything was faster now. Trains, cars, soon airplanes. Messages that once took weeks to travel now crossed continents in hours. The boundaries that had defined human existence for millennia were dissolving, melting away like snow in spring. He walked through it all, a figure from another age, invisible in plain sight. In the trenches of the First World War, he moved among the dying. The mud was endless, sucking at his feet, pulling at the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of things that should never be smelled. He held hands, closed eyes, whispered words that were lost in the thunder of artillery. A young soldier, his face half gone, looked up at him with his remaining eye. "Are you an angel?" he asked, his voice a wet rattle. "No," the wanderer said, "I am only a witness." "Then witness this," the soldier said, and he died. The wanderer witnessed. He witnessed everything. The gas, the fire, the rats, the madness. He witnessed the moment when humanity looked into its own soul and saw something so dark that the world would never be the same. After the war, he walked through the cities of Europe, past the monuments to the dead, past the empty eyes of the survivors. They had seen too much, these people. They had lost too much. But they would recover. They always recovered. That was the terrible beauty of humanity, the ability to heal, to forget, to go on. He could not forget. He could only go on. In the 1920s, he found himself in Berlin. The city was dancing on a volcano, and everyone knew it, but no one said it. Cabarets and cafes, artists and intellectuals, a feverish celebration of life that felt, to him, like the laughter of those who know they are doomed. He sat in a cafe one night, nursing a cup of coffee he did not drink, watching the crowd. A woman sat down at his table without asking. She was young, perhaps 30, with short hair and eyes that held a darkness beneath their sparkle. "You look sad," she said, "sad as an old photograph." "I am old," he said. She laughed. "We're all old. The whole world is old. We've killed so many young men that the rest of us have aged a century." She lit a cigarette, blew smoke toward the ceiling. "What's your story?" "Everyone has a story these days. Mine is boring. I paint pictures no one buys and love men who don't love me back. My story is longer than you would want to hear. Try me." He looked at her, at the bravado, the pain beneath, the desperate need to connect with something real in a world that had become unreal. He had seen this face before, many times, in many centuries, the face of someone reaching out, hopping to be caught. "I have been walking for a long time," he said, "very long. I have seen things that would make your nightmares seem like dreams. I have held the hands of the dying in every century, in every language. I have watched empires rise and fall, cities burn and rebuild, lovers meet and part. I have outlived everyone I have ever loved." She stared at him, her cigarette forgotten, smoke curling up past her face. "That's a good story," she said finally. "You should write it down. It has been written many times by many people. They never get it right." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that might have been curiosity, might have been recognition. "Who are you, really?" He did not answer. He simply looked at her, letting her see what he was, or as much as anyone could see. Her face changed. The bravado fell away, replaced by something else. Wonder, fear, belief. "The Wandering Jew," she whispered. "My grandmother told me stories. I thought they were fairy tales. They are fairy tales, and they are true. That is the strangest thing about stories. They can be both." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, alive, pulsing with the brief, fierce energy of mortality. "Does it hurt?" she asked, "living so long?" "Yes," he said, "but not in the way you think. The hurt is not in the living, it is in the remembering. It is in carrying everyone with you forever, unable to let them go." She nodded slowly, as if she understood. Perhaps she did. In her own way, in her own time, she would learn. They sat together until the cafe closed, talking of small things. Art, music, the color of the sky at dawn, ordinary things, human things. When she left, she kissed him on the cheek, a brief, warm pressure, there and gone. "Thank you," she said, "for being real." He watched her walk away, into the Berlin night, into a future he already knew was dark. He never saw her again. He did not need to. She was already part of him, another face in the congregation, another memory to carry. The years rolled on. The volcano erupted. Berlin fell, rose, fell again. Walls went up, walls came down. The world changed, faster and faster, spinning toward some destination he could not see. He walked through it all, through the Second War, through the camps, through the fire and the ash, through the rebuilding, the Cold War, the uneasy peace, through the rise of computers, the birth of the internet, the strange new world where everyone was connected and no one knew each other. And always in the back of his mind, he carried the image of her, the woman on the ridge, the Kaleech, the eternal mother searching for her child. He never found her, but he never stopped looking. One night late in the century, he stood on a bridge in Prague, the same city where he had met the alchemist 200 years before, the same river flowing beneath him, the same stars overhead. He reached into his pocket and took out the carving, the figure of a woman, arms outstretched, face lifted. It was worn now, smoothed by decades of handling, but still recognizable. He held it in his palm and looked up at the stars. "Wherever you are," he said aloud, "whoever you are, I hope you find her. I hope you find your daughter. I hope you find rest." There was no answer. There never was. But for a moment, just a moment, he felt something, a warmth like a hand on his shoulder, a presence like someone standing just behind him. He turned. The bridge was empty, but the feeling remained. He put the carving back in his pocket and walked on, into the night, into the new century, into the endless road. Behind him, the river flowed on, carrying the lights of the city toward the sea. And somewhere, on another road in another country, a woman walked alone, carrying her own carving, her own memories, her own endless hope. Two wanderers walking through eternity. Two souls bound by the same curse, the same gift, the same question. When will it end? The answer, as always, was the same. When he returns, they walk toward that answer, each alone, each together, each carrying the weight of centuries. And the road went on. Prague. The name had drawn him for centuries, a magnet pulling at the iron in his soul. He had passed through before, briefly, in the time of the alchemist, but he had never stayed. He had never walked the narrow streets of the Jewish quarter, had never entered the synagogues where prayers rose in languages older than his curse. Now, in the last years of the 19th century, he returned. The city greeted him with fog and the sound of bells. Charles Bridge stretched across the Vltava, its statues looming out of the mist like witnesses to something they would not name. He crossed it slowly, his footsteps echoing on the ancient stones, and entered the quarter they called Joseph. The ghetto. It was not what he expected. In his centuries of walking, he had seen many Jewish quarters, crowded, poor, walled off from the rest of the city. But Prague was different. Here, in the last decades of the 1800s, the walls were coming down. The emperor had granted rights, freedoms, the promise of equality. The ghetto was opening, breathing, changing. But the past clung to it like the fog to the river. In every stone, in every shadow, the centuries of confinement and faith and longing were still present, still palpable. He walked through streets that twisted and turned, following paths laid down in the Middle Ages. He passed the old new synagogue, its Gothic gables dark against the sky. He passed the Jewish town hall, its clock running backwards, counting down to something only God knew. He passed the cemetery. The cemetery stopped him. It was small, crowded, impossibly dense. Grave layered upon grave, headstones tilted at every angle, moss and ivy claiming what time had not yet erased. He stood at the gate, looking in, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Belonging, not because he was Jewish. He had been born a Jew in Jerusalem, though he had long since stopped thinking in those terms. But because this place, this small patch of earth, held more memory than any place he had ever seen. More lives, more hopes, more ending. He entered and walked among the grave. The names were in Hebrew, in German, in languages he could read but not feel. He touched the stones, cold and damp, and imagined the hands that had carved them, hands that had long since turned to dust. At the far end of the cemetery, near the wall, he found a grave that was different, larger than the others, marked by a stone that seemed to pulse with something, energy, memory, presence. He knelt before it and read the name. Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel, the Maharal, the great scholar, the mystic, the one who, according to legend, had done what no one else had ever done. He had created life. The golem. The wanderer sat before the grave as the fog thickened and the light faded. He did not pray, he had forgotten how, but he remembered. He remembered the stories he had heard over the centuries of the clay figure brought to life to protect the Jews of Prague, of the rabbi who had used ancient magic, the secrets of the Sefer Yetzirah, to animate the dust of the earth, of the golem who had served and protected, and finally, when it grew too dangerous, been returned to the clay from which it came. A creature made by human hands, a being that was not quite alive, not quite dead, a thing that walked and spoke and obeyed, but had no soul. The wanderer understood that being. He understood what it was to exist without the possibility of ending. He understood what it was to serve a purpose, not of your own choosing. He sat at the grave through the night, and in the morning, he was still there. A man found him, an old man, with a beard as white as the fog and eyes that had seen their own share of centuries. He wore the clothes of a scholar, black and worn, and he carried a book under his arm. "You have been here all night," the man said. It was not a question. "Yes, this is not a place for living men to spend the night. The dead are restless here." The wanderer looked at him. "I know the dead. They are not restless, they are at peace. It is the living who cannot rest." The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if confirming something he had suspected. "Come," he said, "I have food, and questions, many questions." The wanderer rose and followed him out of the cemetery into the narrow streets of Joseph, toward a house that leaned against its neighbors like an old man leaning on his friend. The door opened, and he stepped inside. Behind him, the cemetery slept on, its stones waiting for the dawn that would not come for many hours yet. The old man's name was David Gans, and he was a student of history. Not the history of kings and battles, but the history of his people. The history written in scraps and whispers, in the margins of prayer books and the memories of grandmother. He had spent his life collecting stories, and his small house was filled with them, shelves of books, piles of manuscripts, boxes of letters tied with ribbon. He led the wanderer to a table by the window where a simple meal waited. Bread, cheese, a bowl of soup that steamed in the cold air. They ate in silence, as men do who have learned that words are not always necessary. When the meal was finished, David Gans leaned back in his chair and looked at his guest with eyes that missed nothing. "You are not a tourist," he said. "You are not a scholar. You are not a pilgrim, at least not the kind that comes to Prague seeking God." He paused. "You are something else, something I have only read about." The wanderer met his gaze. "What have you read?" "Many things, the chronicles of Matthew Paris, the German pamphlets, the French poems, the stories that accumulate around a figure like dust around a light." He leaned forward. "They say you are real, they say you walk, they say you were there at the beginning." "I was there." The words hung in the air between them, simple and heavy as stone. David Gans did not flinch. He did not cross himself or whisper a prayer. He simply nodded, as if confirming a fact he had long suspected. "And now you have come to Prague, to the ghetto, to the grave of the Maharal." He gestured toward the window, toward the cemetery beyond. Why? The wanderer considered the question. Why had he come? He had been asking himself the same thing since he entered the city. "I wanted to understand," he said finally. "The golem, the creature of clay, I wanted to understand what it means to be made, not born, to have a purpose, not a soul, to exist because someone else willed it." David Gans studied him for a long moment. "You see yourself in the golem." "I see a reflection, a distorted one, but a reflection nonetheless." The old man nodded slowly. The golem was made to protect, to serve, to be a shield for the people. When its work was done, it was returned to the earth from which it came. It did not suffer, it did not long for anything, it simply stopped. And I cannot stop. No, you cannot. David Gans rose and moved to a shelf, pulling down a book bound in cracked leather. He opened it carefully, turning pages until he found what he was looking for. Listen to this. It is a story from our tradition, a commentary on the creation of Adam. He read aloud, his voice soft and rhythmic. When the Holy One created Adam, he gathered dust from all four corners of the earth, red from the east, black from the west, white from the north, and green from the south. And from this dust, he formed a golem, a body without a soul. Then he breathed into its nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a living being. He looked up. Do you see? Every human is a golem in the beginning, clay and breath, earth and spirit. The difference is that Adam was given a soul, and with it, the gift of death, the gift of ending. The golem of the Maharal was given only the clay, no soul, no death, only purpose. The wanderer felt the words settle into him, finding spaces he had not known were empty. I have a soul, he said. I think, I feel, I remember, but I cannot die. So what am I, human or golem? David Gans closed the book and set it on the table. You are what you have always been, a man who was given a terrible gift or a terrible curse, depending on how you see it. But the question is not what you are, the question is what you will become. They sat in silence as the light outside the window shifted, the fog thinning, the city emerging from its blanket of gray. Tell me about the Maharal, the wanderer said. Tell me about the golem. And David Gans told him. He told of the 16th century, when the Jews of Prague were threatened by blood libels and pogroms, when the emperor turned a blind eye to their suffering. He told of Rabbi Loew, the Maharal, who went to the river at night and shaped a figure from the clay of the bank. He told of the rituals, the sacred names, the moment when the golem opened its eyes and stood on its own feet. He was called Joseph, David Gans said. After the biblical Joseph, who saved Egypt from famine, he looked like a man of 30. He could not speak, but he understood. He served the rabbi, protected the ghetto, did whatever was asked of him. And then, as always happens with power, it grew dangerous. The golem grew. It became stronger, more independent. Some say it fell in love. Some say it began to destroy. The rabbi realized that the creature he had made could no longer be controlled. He paused. So he took it back to the river, to the place where it was born. He reversed the rituals, removed the sacred names, and the golem returned to the clay. The wanderer closed his eyes. He saw the figure, the creature of earth, sinking back into the mud, becoming nothing, finding peace. They say its body is still there, David Gans continued, in the attic of the old new synagogue, hidden behind a wall, waiting. Waiting for what? The old man shrugged. For someone to bring it back, for the need to arise again, for the cycle to repeat. The wanderer opened his eyes. Will it? Who can say? The world does not change. The dangers do not disappear. The need for protection, for a shield against those who wish us harm, that need is eternal. He looked at the wanderer with something like pity. You understand that better than most. The wanderer rose and moved to the window. Below in the street, people were going about their lives, shopping, talking, children playing, ordinary life, human life. The golem was lucky, he said quietly. It was allowed to stop. David Gans came to stand beside him. You see it as luck. Others would see it as tragedy. To exist, to serve, and then to be unmade, is that not a kind of death? It is an ending. That is all that matters. They stood together, watching the life of the ghetto flow past, and neither spoke. Finally, David Gans laid a hand on the wanderer's shoulder. Stay with me tonight. Rest, eat, talk. Tomorrow, if you wish, I will take you to the synagogue. I will show you the attic. The wanderer nodded. Thank you. That night, he slept in a real bed for the first time in years. He did not dream. He never dreamed, but he rested, and in his rest, he felt something he had not felt in centuries. A connection, a thread linking him to this place, these people, this story. In the morning, they would go to the synagogue. They would climb to the attic. They would stand before the wall that hid the body of the golem. And the wanderer would learn something about himself that he had never understood before. The old new synagogue stood in the morning light like a witness to centuries. Its weathered stones held the memory of prayers that had risen from this spot for over 700 years. The wanderer stood before it, feeling the weight of all those prayers pressing against him, and for a moment he could not move. David Gans waited beside him, patient as the stones themselves. It is called the Old New Synagogue, he said, because when it was built, it was new. But the people who built it brought stones from the old temple in Jerusalem, stones that had felt the feet of priests, had heard the songs of Levites, so it is old and new together, like you. The wanderer looked at him. You see too much. I see what is there. That is my gift and my curse. He gestured toward the entrance. Come, the attic is not open to visitors, but the caretaker is an old friend. He will let us climb. They entered. The interior was dim, lit by candles, and the faint light filtering through small window. The bimah stood in the center, surrounded by an iron cage. The seats of the congregation stretched back into shadow, and above them, the vaulted ceiling rose into darkness. David Gans led him through a small door, up a narrow staircase, into a world of dust and silence. The attic was vast, a labyrinth of beams and stored objects, of forgotten things waiting to be remembered. Light came through small windows, falling in slanting rays that illuminated dancing dust motes. The air was thick with age, with the accumulated breath of centuries. At the far end of the attic, against the wall, stood a pile of debris, old furniture, broken boxes, things that had outlived their usefulness. And behind them, barely visible, a sealed door. There, David Gans whispered, behind that door, they say the golem lies there, returned to clay but not destroyed, waiting. The wanderer walked toward it, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He stopped before the debris, looking at the door. It was old, its wood darkened by time, its hinges red with rust. He reached out and touched it. For a moment, nothing. Then, a vibration, a pulse, something deep within the wood, within the wall, within the space beyond. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence, a awareness, the sense that something on the other side knew he was there. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids he saw it, a figure shaped from clay lying in stillness. Its eyes were closed. Its hands were crossed on its chest. It looked like a man, but not quite. Something was missing, something essential. And yet it was aware, not conscious, not alive, but aware. Aware of him, aware of his footsteps, his presence, his endless walking, aware that another being like itself stood on the other side of the door. Not like itself, not exactly. The golem had been made. He had been born. The golem had no soul. He had one somewhere buried beneath the centuries. The golem could be unmade. He could not. But in that moment, standing before the sealed door, he felt a kinship deeper than any he had ever known. What do you feel? David Gans asked from behind him. The wanderer did not turn. I feel that it knows me, that it has been waiting, not to wake, but to be understood, to be seen by someone who knows what it is to exist without the possibility of ending. And do you understand it? He thought about the question. Did he understand a creature of clay, made to serve, unmade when its purpose was fulfilled, a being that had never chosen, never loved, never lost? No, he said, I do not understand it, but I recognize it, and that is something. He let his hand fall from the door. The vibration faded, the presence receded, and the attic returned to its ordinary silence. They stood there for a long time, two men and a hidden presence, sharing a moment that existed outside of time. Finally, David Gans spoke. There is a story, a midrash. It says that in the world to come, the righteous will be able to create worlds of their own. They will shape golems that are perfect, that live and die as we do, that have souls. The Maharal tried to anticipate that world. He tried to give the golem a soul, but he failed, because souls cannot be made, they can only be given. The wanderer nodded slowly. I was given a soul, and I was given a sentence. The soul remains, the sentence continues. Perhaps in the world to come, even sentences will end. Perhaps. David Gans touched his arm gently. Come, we have been here long enough. The dead do not need our company, and the living grow worried. They descended from the attic, leaving the golem to its centuries of waiting. But the wanderer carried something with him from that place, an understanding, a peace. He was not a golem. He was not a creature of clay, made and unmade. He was a man, cursed and blessed, walking toward an ending he could not see but could, somehow, begin to hope for. That night he sat with David Gans in his small house, surrounded by books and manuscripts, and the accumulated memory of a people who had also walked through centuries of exile. They talked of many things, of the Maharal, of the golem, of the legends that had grown up around them. They talked of the wanderer's own story, of the faces he carried, of the weight of memory. And when the night grew deep and the candles burned low, David Gans asked the question that had been forming in his mind since they met. Do you believe you will ever stop? Do you believe he will return? The wanderer looked at the candle flame, watching it dance and flicker. I have to believe it, he said, because if I do not, then this is all there is. The walking, the remembering, the endless road, and I cannot live with that. I cannot live without hope. David Gans nodded. Hope is what has kept us alive as a people through all the centuries of exile. Hope that one day the Messiah will come, that one day we will go home, that one day the world will be as it should be. He paused. You carry that hope for all of us. You are hope walking. The wanderer shook his head. I am not hope. I am only a man, a tired man. You are more than you know. You are proof that the promise is real, that he spoke and that his words endure, that there is an ending waiting, even if we cannot see it. They sat in silence as the candle burned lower, the flame growing dim, the shadows deepening. In the morning, the wanderer left Prague. David Gans walked with him to the edge of the city, to the road that led east toward the rising sun. I will record this, the old man said. I will write down what you have told me. It will be added to the stories, to the legends. You will live on in words, even after you stop walking. The wanderer looked at him. You believe I will stop. I believe that all things stop eventually. Even the longest road has an end. Even the longest night gives way to dawn. He reached out and took the wanderer's hand. Walk in peace, my friend. Walk toward the dawn. The wanderer clasped his hand, then turned and walked away. Behind him, Prague faded into the mist, its spires and bridges becoming ghosts against the sky. Ahead, the road stretched on, as it always did. But something was different now. Something had shifted. He carried the golem with him now, not as a burden, but as a companion, a silent presence that understood, in its clay way, what it meant to exist without ending. He was not alone. He had never been alone. And somewhere, at the end of all roads, a promise waited. He walked toward it. The 20th century did not arrive. It erupted. He felt it coming in the last years of the 1800s, a tension in the air, a vibration beneath the surface of things. The world was wound too tight, like a clock spring about to break. Everyone felt it, but no one knew what it meant. They only knew that something was coming, something terrible. He walked through the opening years of the new century, and the changes were everywhere. Cities grew taller, reaching toward the sky with steel and glass. Machines replaced horses, replaced hands, replaced thought. The pace of life accelerated until it felt like a fever, a delirium from which no one wanted to wake. He was in Sarajevo in June of 1914. He did not know the name of the Archduke who rode through the streets that morning. He did not know the name of the young man who waited with a pistol on the corner, but he felt the shot, felt it in his bones, a tremor that ran through the earth and spread outward faster than any train, faster than any telegraph. The world lurched, and then it fell. He walked through the war that followed, not around it, not away from it, through it, because that was what a witness did. He went where the story was. The trenches of the Western Front stretched across France like a wound that would not heal. He walked through them, a figure in the mud, invisible to the men who huddled in the darkness. He saw their faces, young, old, terrified, resigned. He saw the rats and the lice and the gangrene. He saw the moment when the whistles blew and they went over the top, into the machine guns, into the wire, into nothing. He held them as they died, hundreds of them, thousands. Their blood soaked into his clothes, his skin, his soul. Their last words became part of him, a litany of loss that would never end. Tell my mother, I never got to see my daughter. Is this what it's always like? Is this what you've always seen? He could not answer. He could only hold them and watch them go and add their faces to the congregation behind his eyes. One night in a dugout somewhere near the Somme, he sat with a group of soldiers who had found a moment of peace in the hell. They shared what little they had, a bottle of wine, some bread, a candle that flickered in the damp air. They talked of home, of women, of the life that waited for them after the war. None of them would survive the next morning's attack. He knew this. He could feel it, the way he could feel the weight of the earth above them, the way he could feel the shells preparing to fall. But he said nothing. What would be the point? Hope was all they had. Hope was the only thing keeping them alive. A young soldier, no more than 19, looked at him across the candlelight. You don't talk much, the soldier said, but you listen, you really listen. He paused. My mother used to say there was a man like you, a man who walked the earth, listening to everyone's stories. She said he was cursed, but I think maybe he was blessed to hear so much, to know so much. The wanderer looked at him. What do you think? The soldier considered. I think I'd like to be remembered, that's all. When I'm gone, I'd like someone to remember that I was here, that I lived, that I loved. You will be remembered. The soldier smiled, a small, sad smile. Thanks, old man, thanks for listening. In the morning, the shells fell. The soldier died with the others, his body torn apart, his name lost to the mud. But the wanderer remembered him. He remembered them all. Every name, every face, every last word. The war ended, or seemed to, The guns fell silent. The men went home, or what was left of them. The world tried to heal. But the wanderer knew the war had not ended. It had only paused, catching its breath before the next wave. He walked through the 1920s, through the jazz and the champagne, through the desperate attempt to forget. He walked through the 1930s, through the rise of new darknesses, new hatreds, new men who promised to make everything right by making everything wrong. In 1933, he was in Berlin. He watched the books burn in the square. He watched the faces of the students who threw them into the flames, their eyes bright with a fervor that looked like faith, but was something else entirely, something older, something that had been lurking in the shadows of humanity since before he began to walk. He walked through the streets afterward, past the ashes of 1,000 volumes. A young woman stood at the edge of the square, tears streaming down her face. She held a book in her hands, one she had saved, hidden, kept from the flame. He stopped beside her. "What did you save?" She looked at him, startled by his presence, by his voice. Then she held out the book. It was a collection of poems, Heine. The cover was singed, the pages warm. "They burned him too," she whispered. "They burned his books. But they can't burn what he wrote. They can't burn the words." "No," he said, "they can't. Words survive. Words outlast." She looked at him strangely, as if seeing him for the first time. "Who are you?" He did not answer. He simply looked at the book, at the words that had survived the flames, and remembered another fire, another city, another time. "I am a witness," he said. "That is all." He walked on, leaving her standing in the square, holding her book, watching him disappear into the smoke-stained city. Behind him, the fires continued to burn, and ahead, darker fires waited. The 1930s bled into the 1940s, and the world went dark. He walked through Germany as the noose tightened. He saw the shops smashed, the synagogues burned, the neighbors turning against neighbors. He saw the faces of those who left, clutching what they could carry, walking toward borders that were already closing. He saw the faces of those who stayed, hoping it would pass, hoping it was a nightmare from which they would wake. It did not pass. It was not a nightmare. It was real, and it was only beginning. In 1941, he found himself in Poland. The country had been torn in half, its people scattered, its cities reduced to rubble. He walked through the streets of Warsaw, past the walls that had been built to contain the Jews. The ghetto, a word he knew well, a thing he had seen before, but never like this, never with this purpose. The walls were high, topped with broken glass. The gates were guarded. Inside, 250,000 people were crammed into spaces meant for thousands. They starved, they sickened, they died in the streets, and the living stepped over them because there was nowhere else to step. He entered the ghetto as he entered every place, on foot, unseen, a ghost among the living. The streets were crowded with the walking dead, their eyes hollow, their bodies reduced to bone and skin. Children begged, their voices thin as wind. Old men sat against walls, their heads bowed, their lips moving in prayers that no longer reached heaven. He walked among them, and for the first time in centuries, he felt something he had thought long dead. Rage. Not at the Germans, though they deserved it. Not at the world, though it had looked away. At himself, at his own helplessness, at the curse that allowed him to witness but not to act, to see but not to save. He could not die, he could not be killed. He could walk through fire and emerge unscathed, but he could not stop the fire. He could not shield a single child from the bullet, the hunger, the fear. What was the point of eternal life if it could not be used to save? He found a corner, a space between two crumbling buildings, and he sat. He put his head in his hands, and for the first time since the desert, he wept. Not for himself, for them, for all of them, for the millions whose faces he would carry, whose names he would remember, whose last moments would become part of the endless archive of his memory. A hand touched his shoulder. He looked up. A woman stood before him, old and young at once, her face familiar in a way he could not place. She wore a coat too thin for the cold, and her eyes held the same sorrow he had seen in his own reflection. "You feel it too," she said, "the weight, the helplessness." He stared at her, and then he knew. The woman from the ridge, the Kaleach, the eternal mother searching for her child. She was here, in the ghetto, in Warsaw. "You," he whispered. She nodded slowly. "I have walked as you have walked. I have seen as you have seen. And now I am here in this place watching my children die." Her voice cracked, but she did not weep. Perhaps she had no tears left. "I have been looking for my daughter for 2,000 years, and now I walk among her descendants watching them perish, and I cannot save them. I cannot save any of them." He rose and stood before her, two wanderers meeting at last in the heart of darkness. "How long have you known?" he asked. About me. Since the beginning, since the stories began, I heard of a man who walked, a man who could not die, and I knew there was another. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. I have been looking for you too, not to find my daughter. She is lost to me forever, I know that now, but to find someone who understands, someone who carries the same weight. They stood together in the narrow street, surrounded by the dying, and for a moment, the horror receded. For a moment, they were simply two people, holding hands, sharing a burden that no one else could comprehend. We cannot save them, he said, but we can witness, we can remember, we can carry them with us so that they are not forgotten. She nodded. That is all we can do. That is all we have ever been able to do. She looked around at the ghetto, at the faces pressed against windows, at the children playing in the shadows of death. But is it enough? Is remembering enough? He did not have an answer. He had never had an answer. They walked together through the ghetto, two ghosts among the living. They held the hands of the dying. They whispered words of comfort in languages ancient and new. They carried water to those who could not walk. They closed the eyes of those who could not see. And when the uprising came, in the spring of 1943, they were there. He stood with the fighters in the bunkers, watching them prepare for a battle they could not win. They were young, most of them, their faces set with a determination that was almost beautiful. They knew they would die. They knew the ghetto would burn, but they would fight. They would resist. They would show the world that Jews did not go quietly to slaughter. He could not fight. His curse would not let him, but he could stay. He could witness. The woman stayed with him. She had found her daughter's face in every face she saw, and she could not leave them. The Germans came with tanks and flamethrowers. The ghetto burned. The fighters fought and died and were forgotten by a world that did not care. When it was over, when the last bunker was destroyed and the last fighter was killed or captured, the wanderer stood in the ruin. The woman stood beside him. Smoke rose from the rubble. The smell of death was everywhere. I have to go, she said. I have to keep walking. It is all I know how to do. He nodded. I understand. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small carving. A woman, arms outstretched, face lifted, the same as the one he had found on the ridge so many years ago. Take this, she said, so you will remember me, so you will know that you are not alone. He took it and he gave her his own carving in return, the one he had made on the mountain, the face of sorrow and hope. They stood for a moment, hands clasped, carvings exchanged. Then she turned and walked away, into the smoke, into the ruins, into the endless road. He watched her go, and when she was gone, he looked at the carving in his hand, the woman with arms outstretched, the eternal mother. He put it in his pocket, next to the carving she had given him years ago, without knowing it was hers. Two carvings, two wanderers, two souls bound by the same curse. He walked out of the ghetto, out of Warsaw, out of the ruins. Behind him, the smoke rose toward heaven, carrying the souls of the dead. And ahead, the road stretched on, as it always did. He walked. After Warsaw, the world became a blur of pain. He walked through the camps, not as a prisoner. He could not be held, could not be killed, could not be stopped. He walked through them as a witness, invisible, silent, present. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that would become synonyms for hell. He walked through their gates, past their wires, into their chambers. He stood in the gas chambers as the doors closed. He stood in the crematoria as the ovens burned. He could not save them. He could only witness. And witness he did, face after face, name after name, last word after last word. The congregation behind his eyes swelled to millions, a city of ghosts that would never stop growing. In Bergen-Belsen, after the liberation, he walked among the survivors. They were skeletons, hollow-eyed, barely alive. They stared at nothing or at everything, and they did not see him. But one saw him, a young woman, perhaps 20, her head shaved, her body wasted. She looked at him as he passed, and her eyes widened. You, she whispered, I know you from the stories. My grandmother told me, the man who walks, the man who witnessed. He stopped. He knelt beside her. I am that man, he said. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers like bird bones against his skin. Then tell me it meant something. Tell me their deaths meant something. He looked into her eyes, and he saw the question that had haunted him for 2,000 years, the question that had no answer. I cannot tell you that, he said. I can only tell you that I saw them. I saw everyone. I remember. And as long as I remember, they are not gone. She nodded slowly, and something in her face eased. Not much, but enough. That is something, she said. That is something. She died that night. He held her hand as she went, and he added her face to the congregation. After the war, the world tried to rebuild. The Nuremberg trials, the declarations of human rights, the creation of a Jewish state. The survivors scattered, some to Israel, some to America, some to places they had never heard of before the war. He walked through all of it, through the trials, where justice was done but could never be enough, through the declarations, where words tried to contain horrors that words could not contain, through the birth of Israel, where his people finally had a home after 2,000 years of wandering. He stood on a hill in Jerusalem, looking down at the city that had once been his home. It had changed, it had grown, it had been fought over and rebuilt and fought over again, but it was still there, still standing, still holy. He thought about that day, so long ago, on the Via Dolorosa. He thought about the face of the man who had looked at him and spoken words that changed everything. He thought about the promise, "Until I return." He was still waiting, still walking, still witnessing. In the 1960s, he was in America. The country was young, barely 2 centuries old, but it pulsed with an energy he had not felt since the Renaissance. Everything was possible here. Everything was new. He walked through the civil rights marches, through the protests against war, through the moments when it seemed like the world might actually change. He stood with the marchers in Selma, felt the weight of their hope, saw the faces of those who believed that love could conquer hate. He knew better. He had seen too much, but he hoped with them anyway, because hope was all there was. In Memphis in 1968, he stood in a crowd outside a motel. A man had been shot, a man who had spoken of dreams, who had carried hope in his voice like a flame in the darkness. The crowd wept and raged and did not know what to do. He stood among them, invisible, and he wept too. Another face for the congregation, another name added to the endless list. The decades rolled on, the Cold War ended, walls fell, new wars began, the world grew smaller, more connected, more chaotic. He walked through it all, a ghost at the feast, a witness to everything. In the 1990s, he returned to Germany, to Berlin, where the wall had fallen and the city was stitching itself back together. He walked through the neighborhoods where Jews had once lived, where synagogues had once stood. Some were being rebuilt, others were marked with plaques, memorials, reminders. He stood before one such plaque, reading the names of those who had been taken from this street, this building, this life. He recognized some of them. He had held their hands as they died. A young woman stopped beside him. She was a student, perhaps, with a notebook in her hand and questions in her eyes. "Do you know someone on this list?" she asked. He looked at her. She was German, young enough to be innocent of the past, old enough to carry its weight. "I knew them all," he said. She looked at him strangely. "That would make you very old." "I am very old." She smiled, a small, uncertain smile. "Are you a survivor?" He considered the question. Was he a survivor? He had survived everything. Wars, plagues, famines, fires. He had survived the camps, though he had never been a prisoner. He had survived centuries that would have crushed anyone else. But survival was not the same as living. "I am a witness," he said. "That is all." She nodded, accepting this, or pretending to. They stood together for a moment, looking at the names on the plaque, the sunlight falling across the street, the ordinary life flowing around them. "I will remember this," she said. "Meeting you, I will write it down." "Do that," he said. "Write it down. Remember, that is all any of us can do." He walked on, leaving her standing before the plaque, her notebook open, her pen moving across the page. Another story, another memory, another page in the never-ending book. The 20th century ended, as centuries do, with fireworks and celebrations, and the hope that the next one would be better. He stood on a hill overlooking a city, which city no longer mattered, and watched the lights bloom in the sky. People cheered, embraced, wept with joy. A new millennium, a new beginning. He felt none of it. For him, it was just another year, another step, another face in the crowd. But somewhere, in the depths of his memory, a small flame still burned, a hope that had survived 2,000 years of darkness. "Until I return." He turned from the lights and walked into the darkness, toward the road, toward the future, toward whatever waited at the end. Behind him, the new millennium began, and the last witness walked on. The world had grown loud. He felt it in every city, every town, every village that had become something else. A suburb, a sprawl, a network of roads and lights and constant, unceasing noise. The hum of electricity, the rumble of engine, the chatter of a billion devices, all speaking at once, all demanding attention. He walked through this world as he had walked through all the others, But something was different now. He was harder to see, not because he had changed, but because the world had. In a time when everyone was looking at screens, no one was looking at faces. He could walk down the busiest street in the busiest city, and no one would notice him. No one would remember him. He was invisible in plain sight, a ghost in the machine. He did not mind. Invisibility had always been his gift, but there was a loneliness to it now that he had not felt before. In the old days, even when they didn't know who he was, people sometimes saw him. Sometimes they met his eyes. Sometimes they smiled or nodded or offered a word of greeting. Now they looked through him. They looked at their phones, their watches, their destinations. They did not see the man standing before them, the man who had walked for 2,000 years. He learned to move differently, to exist in the spaces between attention, to be the blur at the edge of vision, the figure that disappeared when you turned to look. And at night, when the cities quieted and the screens went dark, he found his way to the train, the midnight train. It became his companion, his refuge, his home. Not one train, but many. The last train of the night, running through the sleeping city, carrying the lost and the lonely from one nowhere to another. He would board at some station, find a seat in an empty car, and ride until the end of the line. Then he would get off, walk through the empty station, and board another train going the opposite direction. The rhythm of the rails matched the rhythm of his walking. The same endless motion, the same passing landscape, the same faces that appeared and disappeared without ever truly being seen. On the midnight train, he found his people, the night shift workers, heading home with tired eyes and empty lunch pail, the lovers parting after stolen hours, their faces soft with memory, the lost, the drunk, the desperate, the dreaming. They rode the midnight train because they had nowhere else to go, or because they were going somewhere and couldn't wait for morning. He sat among them, and he watched, and he remembered. One night, on a train running through the outskirts of a city whose name he had forgotten, a young man sat across from him. He was perhaps 25, with the hollow eyes of someone who had not slept in days. He clutched a bag to his chest, and his hands trembled. The wanderer watched him for a long time. The young man did not look at his phone. He did not look out the window. He looked at his hands, at his bag, at the floor. He looked everywhere except at the other passengers. The train stopped. A few people got off. A few got on. The young man stayed. At the next stop, the wanderer moved. He left his seat and sat down across from the young man, close enough to speak without raising his voice. "You are running," he said quietly. The young man looked up, startled. His eyes were red, his face pale. "What? You are running from something or towards something. I cannot tell which." The young man stared at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who has been running for a very long time." The young man's laugh was bitter, hollow. "You don't know anything about me. Tell me." For a long moment, the young man said nothing. The train rattled on, its wheels singing against the tracks. The lights flickered. Outside, the city slid past, dark buildings, empty streets, the occasional glow of an all-night diner. Then slowly, the young man began to talk. He spoke of a girl, of love, first and fierce and foolish, of promises made in the dark, of plans for a future that would never come, of the night she left, taking everything with her, his heart, his hope, his reason for staying. He spoke of the months that followed, the drinking, the fighting, the losing of jobs and friends, and finally himself. He spoke of the bag in his lap, everything he owned, everything he could carry. He spoke of the train and the night and the feeling that he was disappearing, fading, becoming nothing. "I don't know where I'm going," he said. "I don't know what I'm looking for. I just know I can't stop. If I stop, I'll have to think. If I think, I'll have to feel. And I can't feel, not anymore." The wanderer listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer advice. He simply listened, as he had listened to thousands of others across thousands of years. When the young man finished, the wanderer spoke. "I have been running for 2,000 years, he said. "I have run from cities and toward them, from love and toward it, from death and toward the one thing that will not let me die. I have run so long that running is all I know. But I have learned something in all that time, something you may not be ready to hear." The young man looked at him. "What? Running does not work. You cannot outrun yourself. Wherever you go, you will be there, waiting. The only way to escape is to stop, to turn around, to face whatever it is you are fleeing." The young man's eyes filled with tears. "I can't. It's too big. It's too much." "It is never too much. You are stronger than you know, stronger than you can imagine." The wanderer leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have seen empires fall. I have seen plagues wipe out cities. I have seen the worst that humanity can do to itself, and I have seen people survive it. People like you, people with nothing but the will to take the next step. The train slowed, approaching a station. The young man looked out the window, then back at the wanderer. "Who are you?" he asked again. "Really?" The wanderer did not answer. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the carvings, the woman with arms outstretched. He pressed it into the young man's hand. "Take this. It belonged to someone who ran for even longer than I have. She never found what she was looking for, but she kept walking. That was enough." The young man looked at the carving, turning it over in his hands. When he looked up, the seat across from him was empty. The train had stopped. The doors were open. He could see the platform, the stairs, the street beyond. He stood, clutching the carving, and stepped off the train. Behind him, the doors closed, and the train pulled away into the night. He stood on the platform for a long time, alone in the darkness, holding the carving. Then he walked up the stairs, toward the street, toward whatever waited. He did not know where he was going, but for the first time in months, he was not running. He was walking. The train carried him through the night, through the suburbs, and into the countryside, where the lights grew sparse and the darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. He sat alone in the car, the carving still warm from the young man's hand. He had given away one of his treasures, the woman with arms outstretched. It felt right. The carving had been meant to travel, to comfort, to pass from hand to hand across the centuries. It had found a new home, a new purpose. He reached into his pocket and touched the other carving, the face he had made on the mountain, the face of sorrow and hope. It was still there, a companion in the darkness. The train stopped at a small station, little more than a platform and a light. No one got on, no one got off. The doors closed and the train moved on. He thought about the young man, about his pain, his running, his desperate need to escape himself. He had seen that need in so many faces, across so many centuries. It was the human condition, distilled to its essence, the desire to flee from what we are, to outrun the shadow of our own making. But you could not outrun yourself. He knew that better than anyone. The train entered a tunnel, and for a moment, there was only darkness and the roar of wheels against steel. Then it emerged, and the countryside was gone, replaced by the outskirts of another city. Factories, warehouses, the backs of buildings that no one bothered to make beautiful. He watched it pass, and he thought about the woman, the Kalisz, the eternal mother. He had not seen her since Warsaw, since the ruins and the smoke. He did not know if she still walked. He did not know if she had finally found what she was looking for, or if she had simply stopped, unable to take another step. He hoped she had stopped. He hoped she had found rest. He hoped that somewhere, in some quiet place, her arms were wrapped around her daughter at last. The hope was probably foolish, but hope was all he had. The train slowed, approaching a larger station. This one had lights, people, the hum of late-night life. A few passengers boarded, a woman with a suitcase, a man in a suit, a teenager with headphones and a distant expression. The teenager sat across from him, slumped in the seat, eyes fixed on a phone. Music leaked from the headphones, a tinny beat that the wanderer could feel more than hear. He watched the teenager for a while, young, maybe 17, dark circles under his eyes, a restlessness in his fingers as they scrolled through images that meant nothing. The train moved on. The teenager did not look up. After a time, the wanderer spoke. "What are you looking for?" The teenager glanced up, startled. He pulled off his headphones. "What? On your phone? What are you looking for?" The teenager shrugged. "Nothing, just killing time. Time does not need killing. It needs living." The teenager laughed, a short, humorless sound. "That's deep, man. You some kind of philosopher." "No, just old." The teenager looked at him more closely, his eyes narrowing. "You're weird, you know that." "Yes, I know." Something in the wanderer's voice made the teenager pause. He put his phone down, really looking for the first time. "You okay?" the teenager asked. "You look, I don't know, sad, like you've seen some stuff." "I have seen some stuff, yes." The teenager nodded slowly. "Me too, not like old person stuff, but stuff." He looked out the window at the darkness rushing past. "My dad died last year. My mom's a mess. I'm just trying to get through, you know, one day at a time." "I know." They sat in silence for a while, two strangers on a midnight train, connected by nothing but the moment. Then the teenager spoke again. "Do you believe in God?" The question hung in the air, simple and impossible. "I believe in a man," the wanderer said. "A man I met once, a long time ago. He said something to me that I have never forgotten, and I am still waiting for him to come back." The teenager stared at him, That's really weird, man, but also kind of beautiful." He paused. "Do you think he will come back?" The wanderer looked out the window at the lights of the city approaching. "I have to believe it," he said, "because if I do not, then everything I have seen, everything I have carried, everything I have lost, it all means nothing." The teenager nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. I feel that way about my dad sometimes. Like if I stop believing that he's somewhere watching, then it was all for nothing. His life, his death, everything." They sat together as the train pulled into the station, as the lights grew brighter, as the platform filled with waiting passengers. The teenager stood, pulling on his backpack. He looked at the wanderer one last time. "Thanks," he said, "for talking, for listening. I don't know why, but it helped. That is why I am here." The teenager nodded and walked off the train, disappearing into the crowd. The doors closed. The train moved on. The wanderer sat alone again, his hand in his pocket, touching the carving. Another face for the congregation. Another moment of connection in the endless night. The train carried him through the city, past sleeping buildings and empty streets, past the lives of those who dreamed while he watched. He thought about the teenager, about his father, about the grief that would shape his life. He thought about all the young people he had seen across the centuries, carrying their own burdens, fighting their own battles, finding their own way. They were so brave, these humans, so fragile and so brave. They lived their brief lives with an intensity he could only watch and admire. They loved and lost and hoped and feared and died, and in that dying, they found a meaning he could never quite grasp. He was eternal, they were fleeting, but in some way he could not explain. They were the lucky one. The train reached the end of the line. The conductor walked through, checking for passengers, and found him sitting alone in the dark. "Last stop," the conductor said. "Time to get off." The wanderer rose and walked off the train, onto the empty platform, into the night. The station was small, a suburban outpost with a single exit leading to a parking lot and a street. He walked through the exit and stood in the lot, looking up at the stars. They were dimmer here, washed out by the lights of the city in the distance, but they were there. They were always there. He began to walk, following the street toward nowhere, toward everywhere. Behind him, the train pulled away, its lights disappearing into the darkness. Ahead, the road stretched on. He walked. The hours before dawn are the longest. He had learned this long ago in the first centuries, when every night felt like an eternity and every dawn felt like a miracle. Now, after 2,000 years, the hours before dawn were simply hours, no longer or shorter than any others, but they felt different. They felt heavy, laden with the weight of all the nights that had come before. He walked through the sleeping city, past houses where families dreamed, past apartments where the lonely stared at ceilings, past hospitals where the dying took their last breath. He walked, and he witnessed, and he remembered. In an all-night diner, he stopped. The lights were bright, harsh, revealing. A few customers sat at the counter, a truck driver nursing coffee, a woman in a torn coat staring at nothing, a man in a suit who had missed his last train home. He took a seat at the end of the counter, away from the others. The waitress came, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile. She did not ask questions. She simply poured him a cup of coffee and moved on. He sat with the cup in his hands, not drinking, just feeling the warmth. It was a small thing, warmth, a small thing that had sustained him through centuries of cold. The woman in the torn coat moved closer, sliding onto the stool next to him. She smelled of cigarettes and the street. Her eyes were clear, though too clear for someone who had been drinking. She was just lost, just alone. "You got the look," she said. "What look?" "The look of someone who's been everywhere and seen everything. The look of someone who's tired of both." He looked at her. In her face, he saw echoes of others. The woman in Paris fleeing the terror, the young soldier in the trenches, the teenager on the train, all the lost ones, all the seekers, all the ones who had sat beside him in the darkness and asked, without words, for something he could not give. "I am tired," he said, "but I cannot stop. None of us can stop. That's the deal, right? You're born, you live, you die. You don't get to stop in between. I have been living for a very long time." She nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "How long?" "Longer than you could imagine." She studied him, her head tilted, her eyes curious. "You're not crazy. I can tell. I know crazy. I've been crazy. You're not that." She paused. "You're something else. Something I've heard about in stories. When I was a kid, my grandmother used to tell me about a man who walked forever. A man who couldn't die. She said he was cursed, but I always thought maybe he was blessed to see so much, to know so much." What did your grandmother say about him? She said he was looking for something or someone. She said he would never find it, but he would never stop looking. And that was the point. The looking was the point. She smiled, a small, sad smile. I used to think I was like that, looking for something I'd never find, a home, a love, a reason to get up in the morning. She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. I'm still looking. He reached into his pocket and touched the carving, the face of sorrow and hope. He did not take it out. He simply felt it there, a presence, a companion. Maybe the looking is the point, he said. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Keep looking, keep walking, keep hopping, that one day we'll find what we're searching for. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched his hand, briefly, lightly. Thanks, she said, for talking to me, for seeing me. Most people don't see me. I see you. She nodded and slid off the stool, walking toward the door, toward the street, toward whatever waited. He watched her go, and when she was gone, he looked at his coffee. It was cold now. He left it on the counter, paid for it with cash that was older than the waitress, and walked out into the dawn. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The city was waking. Cars filled the streets. People hurried to work, to school, to the business of living. He stood on a corner, watching them flow past. So many faces, so many lives, so many stories he would never know, never carry, never remember. But some he would. The young man on the train, the teenager with the headphones, the woman in the diner. They were part of him now, part of the endless congregation behind his eyes. He walked on through the morning, through the city, through the day. At a crosswalk, he stopped beside a mother and her child. The child, a girl of perhaps 5, looked up at him with the direct, unguarded gaze of the very young. You look sad, she said. Her mother shushed her, embarrassed, but the wanderer knelt down, bringing himself to the child's level. I am sad, he said, but I am also hopeful. Do you know what that means? The child considered. It means you think things will get better. Yes, that is exactly what it means. She smiled, a gap-toothed smile that lit up her whole face. I think things will get better too. My mommy says every day is a new chance. Your mommy is very wise. The mother smiled, apologetic and proud. The light changed. They crossed the street, the child waving as they went. He watched them disappear into the crowd, and he felt something shift inside him, a warmth, a lightness, a reminder that even after 2,000 years, there were still moments of grace, still moments of connection, still reasons to hope. He walked on through the day, into the evening, toward the night. The trains would be running again soon, the midnight trains, carrying the lost and the lonely through the darkness. He would find one, board it, ride it to the end of the line. But for now, he walked through the city, through the crowds, through the ordinary miracle of another day. His hand was in his pocket, touching the carving, the face of sorrow and hope, the face of a man who had walked for 2,000 years and would walk for as many more as it took, until the promise was kept, until he could finally stop. The sun set behind him, and the city lights flickered on, one by one, like candles in the growing dark. He walked toward them, toward the night, toward the endless road. And somewhere, on another road, in another city, another wanderer walked toward the same dawn. The man who didn't die walked on, and the world walked with him. The road ends where it began. This is the thought that carries him through the final miles, through the final cities, through the final faces. He does not know how he knows, but he knows the end is near, not the end of walking that will come only when the promise is kept, but the end of something else, the end of searching, the end of wondering, the end of being alone. He walks south through countries that blur into one another, through borders that mean nothing to one who cannot be stopped. He walks toward Jerusalem, toward the place where it all began, on a dusty road under spring sun 2,000 years ago. The journey takes months or years. He has stopped counting. He walks through landscapes that feel familiar, though they have changed beyond recognition. Cities have risen and fallen and risen again. Forests have been cleared and planted and cleared again. The very shape of the land has shifted, worn by time and weather and the endless labor of men. But the stars are the same. The stars have not changed. They wheel overhead each night, the same constellations his ancestors saw, the same constellations that watched him walk away from Jerusalem on that first day. He follows them as he has always followed them, toward the east, toward the dawn, toward home. In the hills outside Jerusalem, he stops. The city lies before him, spread across its hills, golden in the light of the setting sun. It is larger than he remembers, more modern, filled with buildings that did not exist when he last saw it. But it is the same city, the same stones, the same sky. He stands on a hill and looks at it, and for a long time, he does not move. He thinks about that day, the crowd, the soldiers, the man with the thorn crown. He thinks about his own words, spoken in irritation, spoken without thought. Move on. He thinks about the eyes that looked into his, the voice that spoke words he has carried for 2,000 years. I am going, and I will rest, but you will walk until I return. He has walked. He has walked through everything, through empires and plagues, through wars and famines, through love and loss, and the endless accumulation of memory. He has walked until walking became the only thing he knew, the only thing he was. And now he is here, at the end of the road, at the beginning of the end. He walks down from the hill, toward the city, toward the gates. The streets are crowded, as they always were. Tourists and pilgrims, merchants and beggars, children playing and old men arguing. The languages are many, Hebrew and Arabic, English and French, languages he has heard before, and languages he has never learned. The city is a Babel, a chaos, a living thing. He moves through it as he has always moved, invisible, silent, a ghost in the crowd. No one sees him. No one knows that the man who walked away 2,000 years ago has finally come home. He finds the street. It is not the same. It cannot be the same. 2,000 years of rebuilding have erased the old paths, buried the old stones, but he knows it, he feels it. This is the place. This is where he stood, in the doorway of his shop, watching a man carry a cross. He stops in the middle of the street, and the crowd flows around him, oblivious. He closes his eyes, and he is there again. He feels the heat of the sun, the press of the crowd, the irritation that rose in him like bile. He sees the man fall, hears the soldier's curse, feels the weight of those eyes looking into his. And he hears his own voice, small and cruel, move on. He opens his eyes. The street is full of strangers. The moment is gone. But something remains, a presence, a warmth, a sense that he is not alone. He turns, and there, at the edge of the crowd, watching him with eyes that have not changed in 2,000 years, stands the woman. The Kaleech, the eternal mother, the wanderer who walked beside him through the ashes of Warsaw. She is here, in Jerusalem, at the end of the road. He moves toward her, and the crowd parts without knowing it, and they stand face to face in the golden light of the setting sun. You came, she says. I came. She looks around at the city, at the crowds, at the light on the stones. I have been here before, many times, looking for her, looking for my daughter. I thought if I could find her, I could stop, I could rest. She looks back at him. I never found her. I am sorry. She shakes her head slowly. Do not be. I understand now. She was not what I was looking for. She was just a shape, a symbol. What I was really looking for was this. She gestures, taking in the city, the sky, the two of them standing together. An ending, a meaning, a reason for all the walking. And have you found it? She looks at him for a long moment. Then she smiles, a small, sad, beautiful smile. I have found you. That is enough. They stand together as the sun sets over Jerusalem, painting the city in shades of gold and rose and purple. The crowds thin, the noise fades, the night begins. Two wanderers at the end of the road, waiting. They found a place to sit, on a low wall overlooking the valley where the sun had disappeared. The city lights began to flicker on below them. A constellation of human making spread across the hill. For a long time, they did not speak. There was no need. 2,000 years of walking had taught them both the value of silence, the weight of words unspoken. She was the first to break it. Do you remember your name? She asked. Your real name, the one you were born with. He considered the question. It had been so long. The name had been worn away by centuries, like a stone in a river, until nothing remained but smoothness and silence. No, he said, I remember the feel of it, the shape of it in my mouth, but the sound is gone. She nodded. I remember mine, Sarah, that was my name. I was Sarah, daughter of Miriam, wife of Joseph, mother of Rachel. She paused, and her voice caught on the last name. Rachel, my daughter. She was 3 years old when they took her, 3 years old. How old? The usual way, soldiers, a village raid. I was in the fields, she was with her grandmother. When I came back, they were both gone. I searched. I never stopped searching. She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I have been searching for 2,000 years. I have walked across every continent, through every country, into every village and city and camp. I have asked every face I met, have you seen my daughter? She would be old now, very old, but I would know her. And you never found her. No, but I found something else. I found the faces, all the children I could not save, all the mothers I could not comfort, all the fathers I could not help. They became my children, all of them. The whole world became my daughter. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold, but it warmed in his grip. I understand, he said. The faces, the remembering, the weight of it all. Yes, you understand. She squeezed his hand. That is why I needed to find you, not to find my daughter, to find someone who understands. They sat in silence as the stars emerged, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds waiting to be planted. What do you think happens? She asked. At the end, when he returns, what happens to us? He had thought about this question for 2,000 years. He had imagined every possible answer: death, oblivion, transformation, peace. He had hoped and feared and wondered and waited. I do not know, he said. I only know that I am ready. Whatever it is, I am ready. She nodded slowly. I am ready too. I have been ready for a long time. They sat together through the night, watching the stars wheel overhead, watching the city sleep below. They talked of small things, the places they had seen, the people they had met, the moments of grace that had sustained them through the darkness. They laughed, sometimes, at the absurdity of it all. Two immortals, sitting on a wall in Jerusalem, swapping stories like old friends at a reunion. Near dawn, she grew quiet. Her hand grew colder in his. Sarah, he said, what is happening? She looked at him, and her face was peaceful in a way he had never seen before. I think it is time for me, she smiled. I think I have walked far enough. He held her hand tighter, as if he could keep her there by force of will, but he knew better than anyone that will could not stop time. Where are you going? Where we all go, where Rachel went, where everyone goes eventually. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers cold against his skin. Do not be sad for me, be glad. I am finally going home. He watched as the light in her eyes began to fade, as her hand grew colder still, as her breath slowed and stopped. She did not close her eyes. She kept them open, looking at him, looking at the sky, looking at something beyond both. And then she was gone, not disappeared, not vanished, simply still at rest, the first rest she had known in 2,000 years. He sat beside her as the sun rose over Jerusalem, painting her face in shades of gold. She looked young now, younger than she had looked in centuries. The lines of sorrow had smoothed away, the weight of searching had lifted. She looked like a woman who had finally found what she was looking for. He stayed with her through the morning, through the crowds that gathered and dispersed, through the ordinary life of the city flowing around them. No one noticed the woman on the wall. No one noticed the man who held her hand. When the sun was high, he rose. He lifted her gently, carried her through the streets, through the gates, out into the countryside beyond. He found a place on a hillside overlooking the city where the grass was soft and the wildflowers bloomed. He laid her there in the earth and covered her with stone. A cairn, an ancient marker, a grave. He stood before it for a long time, looking at the stones, remembering her face. Sarah, daughter of Miriam, wife of Joseph, mother of Rachel, the woman who didn't die until she did. He turned and walked back toward the city, toward the road, toward whatever waited. But something was different now. Something had changed. He was alone again, truly alone, for the first time since Warsaw. But he carried her with him, her face, her voice, her story, another member of the congregation, but more than that, a friend, a companion, a witness to his own witness. He walked through the streets of Jerusalem, and the crowd flowed around him, and he was invisible as always. But he felt less invisible now. He felt seen. By her, by all of them, by the millions of faces behind his eyes. He was not alone. He had never been alone. He walked on. The days that followed were different. He stayed in Jerusalem, walking its streets, sitting in its shadows, watching its life. He did not know why he stayed. He only knew that leaving felt wrong, felt impossible, felt like abandoning something he had not yet found. He walked the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, the street where it had all begun. It was crowded with pilgrims now, Christians from all over the world, carrying crosses, singing hymns, retracing the steps of their Savior. He watched them from the edges, invisible as always, and he remembered. He stood at Golgotha, the place of the skull. A church stood there now, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, its stones worn smooth by the touch of millions of pilgrims. He entered, walked through its chapels, stood before the rock where the cross had been planted. He knelt, he did not know why. His knees had not bent in supplication for centuries, but they bent now, pressing against the stone, and he bowed his head. He did not pray, he did not speak. He simply knelt and waited and remembered. The face, the eyes, the voice. I am going, and I will rest, but you will walk until I return. He had walked through everything, and now, at the end of all roads, he was here, waiting. How long he knelt there, he did not know. Hours, perhaps. The church emptied and filled and emptied again. The light through the windows shifted and faded and returned. He knelt and waited and remembered. And then, in the silence, he heard it. Not a voice, not a sound, something deeper than sound, a presence, a warmth, a sense of being known completely and entirely for the first time in 2,000 years. He looked up. The church was empty. The candles flickered. The air was still. But something was there, someone. He rose slowly, his knees protesting after so long. He turned, and there, at the entrance to the chapel, stood a figure. Not the woman, not Sarah, not anyone he had ever seen. A man, dressed simply, in clothes that could have belonged to any century. His face was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of face you would pass in a crowd and forget. But his eyes were not ordinary. They were the eyes that had looked into his on a dusty road 2,000 years ago, the eyes that had spoken the words that changed everything. The wanderer could not move, could not speak, could not breathe. The man walked toward him, slowly, calmly, his footsteps making no sound on the stone floor. He stopped before the wanderer, close enough to touch, and looked at him with those eyes. "You have walked a long way," the man said. The wanderer's voice, when it finally came, was a whisper. 2,000 years. "I know," the man smiled, a small, sad, beautiful smile. "I have watched you, every step, every face, every moment of grace and grief. I have carried you with me as you have carried them." The wanderer felt tears on his face. He had not wept since Warsaw, since the ghetto, since the ashes, but he wept now, freely, without shame. "I did not understand," he said. "For so long I did not understand. I thought it was a curse. I thought you had punished me. But it was not punishment, was it? No, it was not. It was love, love that would not let me go, love that insisted I stay, that I see, that I witness everything." He looked into those eyes, and for the first time he saw what had always been there. Not judgment, not anger, only love, endless, patient, unbearable love. "I needed a witness," the man said, "someone who would see it all, the beauty and the horror, the grace and the cruelty, the hope and the despair. Someone who would carry it all, remember it all until the end. You were that witness." The wanderer nodded slowly. "And now, is it the end?" The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched the wanderer's face, his hand warm against the tears. "Now you rest," he said. "You have walked far enough, you have seen enough, you have carried enough, now you rest." The wanderer felt something shift inside him, a loosening, a release. The weight of 2,000 years began to lift, slowly, gently, like a burden being lifted from tired shoulders. "What about them?" he asked. "The faces, the congregation, all the ones I have carried, what happens to them? They are with me now, they have always been with me. You carried them, but I held them. You remembered them, but I never forgot." The man smiled again. "They are home, and now so are you." The wanderer closed his eyes. He felt the warmth of the hand on his face, the presence beside him, the peace that he had sought for 2,000 years. And then he felt nothing. No weight, no pain, no memory, no walking. Only rest. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a pilgrim found a man kneeling before the rock of Golgotha. He was old, impossibly old, with a face worn smooth by centuries of sorrow. His eyes were closed, his hands were clasped. He looked like he was praying. But he was not praying, he was still. The pilgrim called for help. The authorities came. They tried to identify him, to find his family, to understand who he was and how he had come to be there. They found nothing, no name, no documents, no record of his existence. In his pocket, they found a small carving, a face worn smooth by handling, its expression one of sorrow and hope. They could not explain it. They could not understand it. They buried him in a small cemetery outside the city, in an unmarked grave. No one came to mourn. No one knew his name. But somewhere, in the silence between worlds, a man who had walked for 2,000 years finally stopped walking. And the road, at last, was still. The story does not end. It cannot end, because stories once told take on a life of their own. They walk without feet. They speak without voices. They live in the minds of those who hear them, passed from generation to generation, changing and growing and becoming something new. The legend of the wandering Jew does not end with his death. It does not end with his rest. It continues, as all legends continue, in the telling. Some say he still walks. Some say he was seen yesterday in a city far from here, on a train or a bus or a crowded street. Some say he will walk until the end of time, and that the man who found rest in Jerusalem was an impostor, a pretender, a shadow of the real. Some say the woman still walks too, the eternal mother, searching for her daughter through the endless centuries. Some say she found her and rests beside her in a grave marked only by stone. Some say nothing. They simply listen to the story and wonder and carry it with them into their own lives, their own walks, their own roads. The candle gutters, the flame flickers and dies. The silence returns. But listen. In the silence, if you listen closely, you can hear it. A step. Just one, faint, distant, barely there. The sound of a man walking. Or perhaps it is only the wind. Perhaps it is only your own heart beating in the darkness. Perhaps it is only the echo of a story told so many times that it has become real. Perhaps. But if you ever find yourself on a midnight train, or a crowded street, or a quiet road at dawn, and you see a face that seems to hold the weight of centuries, a face that looks at you as if it knows you, as if it has been waiting for you. Do not look away. Do not dismiss it as imagination. Meet its eyes and remember, because the man who didn't die walks still. In the story, in the legend, in the silence after the last word. And he is waiting for you to hear his step, waiting for you to carry his story, waiting for you to remember. Thank you for walking this road with me. The candle has burned low and the night is deep, but the story will wait here in the silence until you return.